Thomas Proctor stood within the shadowed archway car section of the Bow Street office, letting the damp chilling seep through the wool of his coats. Egrave 3, it settled in the bone. Morning held no light. Only a sulphurous yellow fog clung degrees the pavement, thick enough to tasty a ring the grit of coal smoke and the sour tan of the river that lay hidden beyond the buildings. He shifted his weight, and the old ache in his left shoulder flared with a dull, familiar throb, a reminder of the truncheon blow taken 6 years prior during the riots near the docks. Pain served as a clock. It marked the hours better than the distant chime of St. Martin in the Fields, which sounded muffled and distorted as it fought its way through the mist. Proctor tucked his hands deeper into his pockets, feeling the cold metal of his watch case against his thumb, though he had no need to check the time. He knew the hour by the rhythm of the street. Cart wheels rumbled over granite sets, iron rims grinding against stone, while the hurried slap of leather soles indicated clerks making for the counting houses before the light failed entirely. A figure emerged from the gloom, moving with the erratic pace of a man unsure of his footing on the slick stones. The blue tailcoat of a metropolitan constable gleamed wetly in the gaslight that flickered above the arch, the brass buttons dull with oxidation. Proctor did not move to greet him, preferring to let the younger man bridge the gap, for urgency always belonged to the messenger rather than the recipient. The constable halted 3 paces away, chest heaving as if he had run the whole way from Holborn, and wiped a gloved hand across his brow despite the cold. "Mr. Proctor." The voice cracked slightly, betraying a youth that the uniform tried hard to conceal. Proctor nodded once, a slow inclination of the head that granted permission to speak without offering warmth. "Inspector sends word from the Edgware Road," the constable said, the words tumbling out in a rush of white breath. "Found a parcel, wrapped in brown paper, heavy." Proctor waited. There was always more to a story than the first telling, especially when the teller was frightened. The constable shifted his weight, boots scraping against the damp stone, and looked down at his own feet as if seeking instruction there. "Blood," the young man added, the word dropping like a stone into a well, "soaked through the twine, smells wrong." "Where lies it now?" Proctor asked, his voice low and gravelly, worn smooth by decades of questioning witnesses who wished they were elsewhere. "Still at the finder's shop. A grocer, name of—" The constable paused, fumbling in his pocket for a notebook that stuck fast in the damp fabric. "Greenacre, James Greenacre. He sent a boy to the station, but the inspector thought you should see it direct." Proctor pushed himself off the stone pillar, the movement stiff, and stepped out from the archway into the full force of the fog. The moisture hit his face like a physical hand, cold and greasy, settling on his eyelashes and dampening the collar of his coat. He looked north towards Edgware, though the road was invisible, swallowed by the yellow-grey soup that blinded the city. A parcel of bones often began as a parcel of meat, and the distinction was merely a matter of time and knife work. He had seen enough of the city's underbelly to know that blood on brown paper rarely signaled a simple butcher's error. "Did this Greenacre touch it?" "Said he did not," the constable replied, emboldened by the direct question. "Claimed a customer left it on the counter whilst he was in the back. When he returned, the man was gone. Only the parcel remained." "And the customer?" "Unknown, no description given other than a tall man in a dark coat." The constable shrugged, a gesture of helplessness that rippled through the heavy wool of his uniform. "Common enough attire for London, sir." Proctor turned his gaze back to the constable, studying the fear that tightened the skin around the young man's eyes. It was not the fear of the fog nor the cold, but the specific terror of a thing touched by death. Blood had a scent that lingered on the hands long after the washing was done, a metallic tang that soap could not entirely remove. Proctor knew this smell well. It clung to the fingernails and settled in the cuticles, a stain that no amount of scrubbing could truly lift. "Take me there," Proctor said. He did not wait for confirmation, but began to walk, his boots finding the rhythm of the pavement without conscious thought. The constable scrambled to keep pace, slipping slightly on a patch of mud before recovering his balance. They moved together into the throat of the street, 2 dark shapes drifting through the mist, leaving the safety of the office behind. Proctor's shoulder pulsed with every step, a steady beat that matched the clatter of a hansom cab passing blindly in the road, the driver cursing the visibility. "Inspector said you'd know what to look for," the constable ventured, trying to fill the silence that stretched between them. "The inspector talks too much," Proctor replied, though there was no heat in the words. "Keep your eyes on the ground and watch for drops, for if it bled at the shop, it bled on the way." "Yes, sir." The city woke around them, slow and reluctant. Shopkeepers raised shutters with a rattle of wood on wood, revealing displays of bread and cheese that looked grey in the poor light. A woman swept the step of a public house, her broom making a dry scratching sound that was quickly absorbed by the fog. Proctor ignored them all. His focus narrowed to the path ahead, to the potential trail of fluid that might mark the route from murder to disposal. He thought of the woman, for it was usually a woman when the remains were parceled. Men were beaten or shot, but women were cut, divided, and hidden, as if the killer sought to erase them piece by piece. They reached the corner where the road widened towards Marylebone, and the air grew thicker with the smell of horses and manure. Proctor stopped, lifting his face to the wind, testing the air for the copper scent of fresh blood over the stench of the street. Nothing came to him but coal smoke and wet dog. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim lower to shield his eyes from the damp, and glanced at the constable. "Did the boy say how the parcel was tied?" "Twine knots were tight. Sailor's knots, maybe," the constable frowned, trying to recall the exact words of the messenger. "Greenacre said he couldn't loosen them without a knife." "Keep it that way," Proctor instructed. "Do not cut it until I see the whole of it." He resumed walking, the pace quickening now that the destination was near. The ache in his shoulder was a companion, a grim partner in this dance of discovery. He did not fear the sight of the remains, for nothing in the dead house could shock him after 30 years of service, but he feared the silence of the victim. The dead did not speak, and it was his burden to find the voice they had lost. The fog swirled around his legs, obscuring the ground, hiding the secrets that the city kept beneath its pavement. He stepped over a puddle of oily water, the reflection of the gaslight shattering under his boot, and continued towards the grocer's shop where the waiting began. The shop stood on the corner where the Edgware Road began its long, grim stretch towards the north, a narrow slip of brick sandwiched between a chandler's and a pub that smelled permanently of stale porter. Greenacre's name was painted in fading gold leaf above the window, the letters cracked like dry skin, promising groceries and provisions to a neighborhood that could scarcely afford either. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of curing hams, sharp cheese, and something else, a cloying sweetness that sat atop the spices like oil on water. Proctor stepped across the threshold, the bell above the door jingling with a cheerful insolence that clashed with the pallor of the man waiting behind the counter. James Greenacre was a small man, neatly dressed in a coat of dark broadcloth that had seen better days but was brushed with meticulous care. His hands rested on the glass countertop, fingers drumming a silent, nervous rhythm against the surface, while his eyes darted from Proctor to the constable and back again, avoiding the parcel that sat wrapped in brown paper near the till. "You are the runner?" Greenacre asked, his voice high and tight, straining to maintain a tone of respectable inquiry. "The boy said you were coming. I told him plainly, I wanted no part of this." "Save your breath for the magistrate," Proctor said, moving closer until the counter separated them by less than an arm's length. "Show me where it lay." Greenacre pointed a trembling finger towards the far corner of the counter, near a stack of sugar loaves. "There, just there. A customer placed it down whilst I was weighing tea for Mrs. Gale. When I turned, he was gone, vanished into the fog as if he were never there at all." Proctor ignored the flourish of the story and leaned over the counter, his gaze fixed on the bundle. It was oblong, tied with coarse twine in a series of intricate knots that spoke of a hand accustomed to rigging or butchery, not the hasty wrapping of a fleeing shopper. The paper was stained dark at one end, the liquid having soaked through to leave a crusty, blackened patch that gleamed wetly in the dim light. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he inhaled, drawing the air deep into his lungs, filtering out the smell of coffee and soap to find the metallic tang beneath. Blood, old blood, cooling in the winter air, mixed with the faint, ghostly trace of lavender that seemed entirely out of place in a grocer's shop. "Did you move it?" Proctor asked, his eyes still on the knots. "Not an inch," Greenacre replied, wiping his palms on his apron. "I dared not. Who knows what filth lies within? It could be the plague for all I know." "The plague does not travel in parcels, Mr. Greenacre," Proctor murmured, finally pulling a pair of thin leather gloves from his pocket. He slid them on, the material creaking softly, and reached out to lift the bundle. It was heavier than it looked, dense with a terrible weight that settled into his wrists. He turned it over slowly, examining the underside where the paper had grown soggy from contact with the counter. No trail led away from the spot. The killer had placed it down and left it there, a gift of horror abandoned in the hopes of confusing the recipient. Proctor set the bundle back down with a dull thud that made Greenacre flinch. He took a knife from his own belt, not to cut the twine, but to slide the blade beneath the knot, testing its tension. The rope was pulled tight, biting into the paper, secured with a surgeon's precision that suggested a mind calm enough to focus on detail even amidst the chaos of disposal. "Who was the man?" Proctor asked, looking up sharply, catching Greenacre off guard. "I told you I did not see him clearly," the grocer stammered, taking a half step back until his hips bumped the shelves behind him. Tall, dark coat, a hat pulled low. He spoke little, paid for nothing, just left the thing and walked out. "I thought it was an order for collection, a delivery for a neighbor perhaps. I am an honest tradesman, Mr. Proctor. I deal in tea and sugar, not this." "Honest men often see more than they admit," Proctor said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that filled the small space. "Especially when fear takes hold." He signaled to the constable, who produced a fresh length of rope to secure the parcel for transport. They worked in silence, the only sound the scrape of boots on the floorboards and the rustle of the paper as they lifted the bundle onto a wooden tray. Proctor watched Greenacre's reflection in the window glass, noting the way the grocer's eyes tracked the movement of the dead weight, a mixture of revulsion and curiosity warring in his expression. There was a calculation there, a quickness of mind that belied his professed ignorance. "Lavender," Proctor said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Greenacre blinked. "Sir." "The handkerchief inside. It smells of lavender," Proctor clarified, though he had not yet seen the cloth, only caught the scent bleeding through the paper layers. "And tobacco, stale tobacco, not the kind you sell in tins, but the rough-cut a laborer might carry in his pocket." "I sell no lavender water," Greenacre said too quickly, his hands twisting the apron into a tight knot. "Mrs. Gable buys her scents from the chemist down the road. I deal in dry goods." "Did I say you sold it?" Proctor asked, stepping around the counter to stand directly in front of the man. The height difference was negligible, but Proctor's presence seemed to expand, filling the room with an oppressive gravity. "I merely noted what the dead woman wore, or what the man who killed her used to wrap her." Greenacre's face drained of color, the ruddy complexion of a man who spent his days indoors turning a sickly gray. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, swallowing hard as if the words had turned to ash in his throat. The silence stretched, brittle and thin, until the constable coughed, breaking the spell. "We are ready, sir," the young officer said, holding the tray with white-knuckled grip. Proctor nodded, taking one last look at the shop. The shelves were neatly stocked, the jars of pickles and bottles of vinegar aligned with military precision, yet the air felt contaminated, poisoned by the object that had rested there. He thought of the woman inside the paper, her head severed, her identity stripped away along with her life, reduced to a parcel on a grocer's counter. It was an indignity that burned in his chest, hotter than the ache in his shoulder. "Attempt 1. Lock up, Mr. Greenacre," Proctor said. He turned towards the door. Since a statement would be required at Marlborough Street before the sun sets, he added that Greenacre must not leave the premises. "Grid. I have customers," Greenacre protested, finding his voice again, though it lacked its earlier strength. "The morning trade, people need their bread." "Let them go hungry," Proctor replied, pushing open the door and stepping back into the fog. "The dead can wait no longer." The cold hit him instantly, a physical blow that cleared the cloying sweetness of the shop from his senses. He walked briskly towards the waiting cart, the constable trailing behind with the grim cargo. The fog seemed to press in closer now, wrapping around them like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the waking city. Proctor glanced back once at the shop window, where Greenacre stood watching them, his face pressed against the glass, pale and distorted. The grocer did not wave, did not nod, but simply stared, his hands still clutching the apron as if it were a lifeline. Proctor turned away, focusing on the path ahead. The parcel lay on the tray, covered now with a sack, but the scent of lavender and blood seemed to follow him, clinging to his coat, seeping into his skin. He climbed into the cart, the wood cold beneath his thighs, and settled in for the journey to the dead house. The wheels creaked as they began to move, the horse snorting softly into the damp air. They rolled forward into the grey void, leaving the grocer and his shop behind, carrying the first piece of a puzzle that would soon consume them all. The fog swallowed the sound of their departure, leaving only the rhythmic clatter of hooves on the wet pavement, a steady beat marching towards the Old Bailey and the justice that waited there, blind and hungry. Gas hissed within the jet above the table, a serpentine sound that competed with the distant rumble of traffic on Great Marlborough Street. Proctor stood beneath the flickering illumination, the yellow light catching the grease stains on the wooden surface where countless depositions had been signed in blood and ink. He laid the coarse wrappings out flat, smoothing the creases with palms that felt too large for the delicate task. The constable waited by the door, shifting his weight from one boot to the other, the leather creaking in the quiet room. "Leave the shutter open," Proctor said, not turning from the table. "The air in here is dead." "So, ventilation, constable, open it." The officer moved to comply, wrestling with the sash until a draft swept in, carrying the smell of coal smoke and horse manure from the street below. Proctor ignored the chill that followed the draft, focusing instead on the layers of paper before him. They were rough, unbleached stuff, the kind a grocer might use for sugar or flour, yet cut with a precision that suggested a ruler had guided the knife. He picked at the edges where the twine had bitten into the fiber, looking for anything tucked beneath the knot. Nothing there, only the impression of the rope, deep and permanent. He peeled back the outer sheet, revealing a second layer beneath, this one stained darker where moisture had seeped through during the journey from Paddington. The scent of lavender rose again, cloying and sweet against the tang of the gas, a perfume that belonged in a parlor rather than on a parcel of human remains. Proctor paused, his fingers hovering over a fold near the bottom corner where the paper had been glued down. It felt thicker there, a slight ridge beneath the pulp. He reached for the knife on the desk, the blade catching the light as he slid it under the glued edge. The paper resisted, then gave way with a tear that sounded like bones snapping. Inside the fold lay a slip of writing paper, concealed as if the sender had feared the contents would be read by prying eyes during transit. Proctor lifted it with tweezers, holding it up to the gas jet to examine the script. "Found something, sir?" The constable leaned in, curiosity overcoming discipline. "Paper," Proctor said. "Addresses." "Is it the killer's?" "It is someone's." The ink was iron gall, dark and corrosive, though slightly smudged where damp fingers had handled it. The handwriting possessed a looped elegance, the strokes confident and flowing, yet there were hesitations in the downstrokes, places where the pen had pressed too hard as if the writer were unused to such speed. Proctor traced the capital G in the word Greenacre written in the address, noting a peculiar flourish at the tail, a hook that curled back upon itself like a fisherman's knot. It was a vanity, a signature of style that spoke of a man who took pride in his penmanship, even when composing a note for an illicit purpose. "Hackney Road," Proctor murmured, reading the line below the name, "near the turning for Kingsland. Shall I send a man to fetch him?" "No," Proctor folded the slip carefully, aligning the edges with military exactitude. "We go ourselves. If this Greenacre is the man who kept the shop, he will expect a summons, not a raid. He will expect the law to move slowly. He might run. He has a shop to lose." Proctor placed the paper into a leather portfolio, the material stiff and worn at the corners. He unlocked a drawer in the desk, the key hanging from a chain around his neck clinking softly against his sternum, and deposited the portfolio inside. The lock clicked shut, a final sound that sealed the evidence away from the prying eyes of clerks and magistrates who might leak details to the press. He turned from the desk, the movement causing the old injury in his left side to flare, a sharp reminder of the riot truncheon that had struck him 6 years prior. The pain was familiar, a companion that arrived whenever the work demanded stillness after motion. He rubbed the spot briefly, then dropped his hand, straightening his coat to hide the gesture. "Prepare the omnibus," Proctor said, walking towards the door. "We leave within the hour." "The magistrates will want a report before we go," the constable said, hesitation marking his voice. "Procedure requires it." "Procedure requires evidence. I have the evidence." Proctor stopped at the threshold, looking back at the table where the wrappings lay discarded like shed skin. "The rest is paperwork for those who sit behind desks. I prefer the street." He stepped out into the corridor, the gaslight dimming as he moved away from the jet. The building smelled of dust and old files, the air stagnant compared to the drafty room he had just left. He descended the stairs, his boots striking the stone steps with a heavy rhythm that echoed in the well. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the grey sky of late afternoon, though the light was already failing. The streets would be crowded soon, workers returning home, carriages jostling for space on the rutted roads. Proctor paused at the entrance, pulling his collar up against the damp air. He touched the pocket where the key rested against his chest, feeling the cold metal through the wool of his coat. The letter was safe, but the name on it hung in his mind, a weight that settled heavier than the portfolio in the drawer. Greenacre, a grocer, a man of commerce who dealt in tea and sugar, according to the landlady's earlier testimony, yet whose name appeared on a parcel containing a dead woman's head. The contradiction sat poorly in his stomach. Men who kept neat shops did not usually dismember their debts. They sued them, or threatened them, or drove them to ruin through legal means. Violence of this caliber required a different temperament, a capacity for cruelty that went beyond mere financial dispute. Yet the handwriting suggested education, and the address suggested respectability. "Sir, the vehicle is waiting," the constable called from the pavement. Proctor stepped out, the noise of the street swallowing his response. He climbed into the omnibus, the interior smelling of wet wool and stale tobacco, and took a seat by the window. The wheels began to turn, carrying them east towards Hackney, towards the lodging house and the man who had signed the letter. He watched the buildings pass, their windows glowing with candlelight, each one a potential hiding place for secrets similar to the one locked in his portfolio. The journey would take 20 minutes if the traffic held, 20 minutes to consider how a grocer became a butcher. Proctor closed his eyes, listening to the rattle of the carriage, the rhythm of the horses' hooves marking time until they reached the next destination. The lavender scent still clung to his coat, faint but persistent, a ghost that refused to be exorcised by the cold air of the street. He opened his eyes as the omnibus lurched over a pothole. The motion jarred his shoulder, sending a fresh spike of pain through the joint. He ignored it. Pain was useful. It kept him awake. "Driver," Proctor called out through the hatch, "keep to the main road, no detours." "As you say, Governor," the driver replied, his voice muffled by the wind. Proctor settled back, watching the gas lamps blur past. The city unfolded around them, a labyrinth of brick and mortar where a man could disappear if he knew which shadows to trust. Greenacre might know, but Proctor knew the shadows better. He touched the pocket again, ensuring the key was still there, then rested his hand on his knee, waiting for the wheels to stop. The lodging house awaited, and with it, the truth behind the flourish on the letter. The omnibus lurched to a halt near Holborn Bars, the brakes screaming against the iron rims until the horses snorted and stamped. Proctor stepped down onto the pavement, his boots finding purchase on the slick stones where mud and horse dung had mixed into a grey slurry. The air here tasted of coal smoke and roasted coffee, a sharper scent than the damp river fog that clung to the docks. He paid the driver with a flick of a coin, then turned towards the row of shops that lined the street, their windows glowing with the yellow haze of gaslight. Business was concluding for the day. Shutters were being drawn over glass, and clerks were sweeping sawdust from the floors onto the curb. Proctor ignored the flow of homeward-bound workers and pushed against the tide, moving west towards the stationers he had noted on his map. The injury in his side throbbed with the cold, a dull ache that settled deep into the bone, but he kept his pace steady. Pain was a metric. If he could walk through it, he could walk through a lie. He found the shop by the sign of the Quill, painted in peeling gold leaf above the door. Inside, the air was still and dry, smelling of glue and stored paper. A single jet hissed behind a green glass shade, casting long shadows across the stacks of ledger books that rose like walls on either side of the counter. An elderly man sat on a high stool, counting bundles of twine with fingers stained black by ink. He did not look up when the bell above the door jangled. "We are closed," the clerk said, his voice thin and papery. "Come back tomorrow." "I require information, not goods." Proctor approached the counter, placing his gloved hands on the wood. Bow Street. The counting stopped. The clerk looked up, his eyes watery behind thick spectacles, and assessed the cut of Proctor's coat, the stance of his shoulders. He set the twine down slowly. "The magistrates send you for debts. I pay my suppliers every quarter like clockwork." "Not for debt, for a purchase." Proctor reached into his pocket and withdrew the folded sketch of the handwriting taken from the parcel's wrapping. He smoothed it on the counter, weighting the corners with his thumbs. "This hand, do you know it?" The clerk leaned forward, gaslight catching the grease on his nose as he squinted at the loops of the G and the sharp cross of the T. "I see many hands. Merchants write fast, yet lawyers write slow. This is neither. Look at the flourishes. It is educated, but hurried." The clerk traced the air above the paper without touching it. "I sold paper like this 3 weeks past. Brown wrapping, heavy stock, used for parcels that must hold weight without tearing." "Who bought it?" "A gentleman, tall and clad in a dark coat." The clerk paused, his mouth tightening as if tasting something sour, before adding that he paid in coin, sovereigns which he counted out one by one. Proctor straightened. "A tradesman would have put it on account." "Indeed." The clerk folded his arms, the sleeves of his waistcoat straining against his elbows as he remarked on it. He asked if the ledger was lost. The man replied that he preferred to settle matters cleanly, wanting no debts and no records. "No records." Proctor repeated the words, letting them hang in the dry air of the shop. A respectable grocer, one who kept a shopfront on the Hackney Road, would rely on credit to move stock. To pay cash for wrapping paper was to hide the transaction from the eye of the ledger, to ensure no name was written down in a book that might be subpoenaed by a curious magistrate. It suggested a man who was already planning for the end of the affair, not the beginning. "Did he buy twine?" Proctor asked. "Strong hemp, enough to bind a trunk." The clerk tapped the counter with a fingernail. "He took it all, said he was moving stock, clearing out for the new year." "And the date?" 28th of December, just before the holidays. With a groan of effort, the clerk turned back to his stool and climbed up. "That is all I know. I have work to finish." Proctor folded the sketch and returned it to his pocket. The date aligned with the surgeon's estimates. Hannah Brown had vanished in the last week of December, her body cut and scattered, while the city was drunk on gin and celebration. Greenacre had bought the shroud for her remains while the bells were ringing. He thanked the clerk with a nod, receiving no reply, and stepped back out into the street. The cold hit him immediately, biting through the fabric of his greatcoat. He walked to the corner where the gas lamp flickered in the wind, shielding the match with his cupped hands before lighting a cigar. The smoke curled around his head, masking the smell of the street for a moment. He took a notebook from his inner pocket, the leather worn smooth by use, and uncapped his pen. 28th deck, paper and twine, cash. He wrote the words quickly, the ink freezing slightly on the page before soaking into the fiber. Below it, he noted the surgeon's estimate of death, 30th deck. The lines converged. The grocer was not merely a man who had lost a tenant or a friend. He was a man who had prepared for a disposal. The use of coin indicated a fear of detection, a consciousness of guilt that preceded the act itself. Most killers reacted to the panic of the moment. Greenacre had planned his logistics with the care of a merchant shipping goods to the colonies. Proctor capped the pen and slipped the book away. The omnibus had departed, leaving the road clear save for a solitary hansom cab rattling towards Shoreditch. He would have to walk the remainder of the way to the Hackney Road lodging. The distance was manageable, and the movement would keep the blood flowing in his legs. He turned east, following the line of the gas lamps as they stretched into the darkness. His mind returned to the clerk's description. tall, dark coat. The same description given by the watermen who found the remains in the canal. The consistency was comforting in a grim fashion. It meant the threads were not fraying, but it also meant Greenacre was careful, and careful men did not leave doors unlocked or trunks unguarded. Proctor touched the pocket where the warrant lay folded against his ribs. The paper felt thin, insubstantial against the weight of what he intended to find. A cart loaded with sacks of flour rumbled past, the driver shouting at his horse to keep the pace. Proctor stepped into the gutter to avoid the spray of mud, his shoulder brushing the rough brick of a warehouse wall. The texture scraped against his coat, a reminder of the physical reality of the city. Laws were written on paper, but justice was done in the mud. He thought of Sarah Gale, the woman reported to be living with the grocer. If Greenacre was the calculator, she was the variable. Witnesses often broke under the pressure of a search, their loyalty dissolving when the constables began to pry up floorboards. He quickened his pace. The fog was thickening again, rolling in from the fields beyond Kingsland to obscure the road ahead. Street signs became ghosts, and the faces of passers-by were blurred smudges of pale skin and dark hats. Proctor kept his eyes on the ground, watching for the change in pavement that marked the turn towards the lodging house. He needed to arrive before the light failed completely. A search conducted in darkness favored the hidden object. A church clock chimed the half-hour somewhere in the distance, the sound muffled by the mist. Proctor checked his pocket watch, the gold case warm from his body heat. He had an hour before full night, enough time to turn the room inside out. He snapped the watch shut and tucked it away, his fingers lingering on the metal. The clue from the stationer was the key that unlocked the door, but he still had to walk through it. The road widened as he approached the turning for Kingsland, the buildings becoming less dense, separated by small yards and coal sheds. He spotted the number on the gate post, the paint peeling from the wood. A light burned in the upper window, a single square of yellow in the grey facade. Someone was home. Proctor stopped at the gate, adjusting his collar and smoothing his hair. He would not kick the door down, not yet. He would knock, and he would watch the face of the man who answered. He pushed the latch. The metal was cold enough to burn the skin. The latch clicked, a sharp metallic sound that severed the muffled roar of the Hackney Road. Proctor pushed the door inward, the wood groaning on hinges starved of oil, and stepped into a hallway that smelled of boiled cabbage and wet dog. Two constables followed, their boots heavy on the flagstones, bringing with them the chill of the street and the distinct authority of the law. A man emerged from the rear room, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag that had long since surrendered its original color. He was short, broad in the shoulder, with a face reddened by the heat of the kitchen range and eyes that narrowed instantly upon seeing the uniform caps. "You cannot come in here," the landlord said, blocking the narrow passage with a body that seemed carved from suet and defiance. "Mr. Greenacre pays his rent. He has rights. You have no warrant for this house, only for the man." Proctor did not speak immediately. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest, and let the silence stretch until the landlord shifted his weight, the floorboard creaking under the movement. From his coat, Proctor drew the folded parchment, the seal of the magistrate broken but the authority intact, and held it out without stepping forward. The paper crackled, a dry sound in the damp air. "We have a warrant to search the premises occupied by James Greenacre," Proctor said, his voice low, stripping the words of any emotion that might be argued against. "Step aside, or be removed for obstructing a peace officer in the execution of his duty." The landlord opened his mouth, perhaps to cite a statute or demand a lawyer, but the look in Proctor's eyes stopped him. It was not anger, but a terrible hollow stillness, the same expression a man wears when staring into a grave he has just dug. The landlord stepped back, clutching his rag, and waved a hand towards the stairs with a gesture of resentful compliance. Proctor nodded to the constables, who moved past the man, their shoulders brushing the peeling wallpaper as they ascended. The room on the first floor was locked. Proctor rapped on the wood, 3 sharp knocks that echoed in the stairwell. No answer came, only the faint settling of the building and the distant rumble of a cart on the cobbles below. He signaled to the larger of the constables, a man named Miller who possessed the strength of a dockworker, and pointed to the latch. Miller drove his shoulder against the door. The wood splintered near the lock, the frame shuddering, and the door swung open to reveal a space dimly lit by a single tallow candle guttering on a table. The air inside was stale, trapped and heavy, carrying a scent that did not belong in a living quarters. It was not the smell of tobacco or unwashed linen, but something sharper, acrid, clinging to the back of the throat like smoke from a burning feather. Proctor stepped across the threshold, his boots crunching on something brittle scattered near the hearth. He crouched, ignoring the protest of his old injury, and examined the fireplace. The grate was filled with ash, grey and fine, but mixed within it were darker fragments, twisted and blackened. "Search the hearth," Proctor ordered, his voice barely rising above a whisper, "gently." Miller knelt beside him, using a poker to sift through the residue. The smell intensified as the ash was disturbed, a sweet, cloying rot that spoke of protein subjected to fierce heat. It was the odor of a butcher's yard after a fire or a boneyard left too long in the sun. Proctor reached into his pocket and withdrew a small glass vial, corked and clean. With a pair of tweezers, he lifted a shard of the blackened material, dropping it into the glass. The fragment clinked against the side, a tiny, final sound. "Bone," Miller said, wrinkling his nose before adding, "and hair." He gestured towards the specimen. "Look at the curl of it." Proctor sealed the vial with wax from his pocket, pressing his signet ring into the soft red pool until it hardened. His hands did not tremble, though his stomach tightened with a cold knot of recognition. This was the disposal method. Greenacre had not merely scattered the remains, he had attempted to annihilate the evidence that could not be easily moved. The missing portions of Hannah Brown were likely rising in this very chimney, drifting out to settle on the roofs of Hackney. He stood, brushing the ash from his knees, and turned his gaze to the rest of the room. It was tidy, unnaturally so, as if scrubbed in a hurry. A bed stood against the far wall, the linens pulled tight. A wardrobe loomed in the corner, its doors shut. Proctor walked to the center of the floorboards, testing each plank with the heel of his boot. One board near the window gave slightly, springing up when he applied pressure. He drew his knife, a small blade used for opening letters, and pried the edge of the wood upward. Beneath the floor, in the dark cavity between the joists, lay a scrap of ribbon. It was dark blue silk, frayed at the edges where it had been torn. Proctor reached down, his fingers closing around the fabric. He pulled it free, holding it up to the candlelight. The color was deep, the quality far too fine for a servant or a common labourer's wife. It matched the description of the ribbon Hannah Brown had been wearing when last seen at the theatre in Drury Lane. He folded the scrap and placed it in his waistcoat pocket, next to the vial of ash. "Nothing else here, sir," Miller called from the wardrobe, which stood open and empty save for a few hangers of polished wood. "No clothes, no trunks, just dust." "Check the adjacent room," Proctor said, moving towards the door that led to the connecting lodgings. "See who occupies it." They passed through the dividing door into a smaller chamber, poorly lit and crowded with furniture that did not match the sparse elegance of Greenacre's room. A woman sat in a wooden chair by the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was dressed in black, her attire respectable but worn, the fabric faded at the elbows. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and fixed on the intruders with a mixture of fear and calculation. She did not rise, she did not speak. "Mrs. Gale?" Proctor asked, stopping a few feet from her. He kept his voice neutral, offering neither threat nor comfort. "I am Sarah Gale," she replied. Her voice was steady, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her own hands. "I was told there would be no disturbance. Mr. Greenacre said the rent was paid in full." "Mr. Greenacre is currently unavailable," Proctor said, his eyes fixed closely on her face as he spoke. "We are searching for a woman named Hannah Brown. Have you seen her in this house?" Gale blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. "Hannah Brown? No, I do not know the name. Mr. Greenacre has many acquaintances, tradesmen and suppliers, but no woman by that name has visited here. Perhaps you have the wrong address." She spoke with a careful precision, each word weighed and measured before leaving her lips. It was the speech of someone who had rehearsed the lines, anticipating the question and preparing the denial. Proctor noted the way her eyes flickered, just for an instant, towards the corner of the room where a large trunk stood locked with a brass padlock. The movement was subtle, a betrayal of the nerve beneath the calm exterior. "She was last seen entering this street," Proctor said, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to specify that it happened on the evening of the 20th of December, and she was with Mr. Greenacre. "If she came, she did not stay," Gale said, her chin lifting slightly. I keep to my own room. I do not pry into the affairs of my landlord. You must ask him." Proctor held her gaze, letting the silence fill the space between them again. He could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her lower lip that she fought to suppress. She was lying, or at least concealing the truth, but she was doing it with the desperation of a woman who believed she had no other choice. To press her now, without the trunk opened or the grocer present, would yield nothing but denial. She would cling to her story until the walls closed in. "We will speak again," Proctor said finally, turning away from her. "Do not leave the premises. A constable will remain outside." He walked back through the rooms, the smell of burnt bone lingering in his nostrils, heavier now that he knew what it was. The ribbon in his pocket felt like a lead weight against his chest. He had the physical evidence, the ash and the silk, but the living witness remained a locked door. He descended the stairs, the landlord watching from the shadows of the kitchen, and stepped back out into the grey afternoon. The fog had thickened, swallowing the street lamps before they could be lit. A runner waited by the gate, breath pluming in the cold, holding a folded letter in his hand. "Message for you, Mr. Proctor," the boy said, thrusting the paper forward. "Just arrived from the Marsh Gate post, said it was urgent." Proctor took the letter. The envelope was of fine quality, the wax seal unbroken. He recognized the handwriting on the front before he even turned it over. It was Greenacre's hand, looping and precise. He broke the seal and unfolded the page, reading the first line by the fading light. The words mocked him, claiming innocence and laughing at the futility of the search. The grocer knew they had been here. He knew they had found the ash. And yet, he wrote as if he were the one in control. Proctor crumpled the letter in his fist, the paper resisting, then yielding. He looked up at the window of the room where Sarah Gale sat, the single square of yellow light now glowing against the encroaching dark. She was watching him. He could feel her gaze through the glass, through the fog, through the layers of deceit that wrapped the house. He tucked the crumpled letter into his pocket, alongside the ribbon and the vial, and turned towards the canal. The water would tell the rest of the story. The dividing door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness separating the room of ash from the room of the woman. Proctor pushed it open. The hinges complained, a dry squeal that cut through the quiet of the house like a knife through wet cloth. He stepped across the threshold, the constables remaining behind to bag the residue from the grate, leaving him alone with the lodger. She sat by the window, though the glass offered no view save for the grey smear of the afternoon sky. A wooden chair, straight-backed and unforgiving, supported her rigid posture. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had bleached white, blood forced from the skin by the pressure. She wore black, the fabric respectable but worn thin at the elbows where the light caught the fray. No tears, no trembling. Just a stillness that felt manufactured, like a shop window display arranged to suggest comfort where none existed. "Mrs. Gale?" Proctor asked. He kept his voice low, stripping it of the authority that usually made suspects flinch. Aggression now would only harden her resolve. "I am Sarah Gale." She did not rise. Her eyes met his, wide and unblinking, fixed on a point just beyond his left shoulder. "I was told there would be no disturbance. Mr. Greenacre said the rent was paid in full." "Mr. Greenacre is currently unavailable." Proctor moved further into the room, stopping a few feet from her chair. The air here smelled different from the fireplace room, less of burnt bone, more of lavender water trying to mask the scent of stale tobacco. "We are searching for a woman named Hannah Brown. Have you seen her in this house?" Gale blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. "Hannah Brown? No, I do not know the name." She shifted her weight, the skirt of her dress rustling against the wood of the chair. "Mr. Greenacre has many acquaintances, tradesmen and suppliers, but no woman by that name has visited here. Perhaps you have the wrong address." The words came out too smoothly, each syllable weighed and measured before leaving her lips, polished by repetition. It was the speech of someone who had rehearsed the lines, anticipating the question and preparing the denial while waiting for the knock on the door. Proctor watched her hands. They remained locked in her lap, but the tendons in her wrists stood out like wire cables. "She was last seen entering this street," Proctor said, taking a single step closer. The floorboard beneath his boot creaked, a sharp report in the quiet room. "On the evening of the 20th of December, with Mr. Greenacre." "If she came, she did not stay." Gale lifted her chin in a defiant tilt that never reached her eyes. I keep to my own room and do not pry into the affairs of my landlord, so you must ask him." Proctor held her gaze, letting the quiet stretch between them until it became a physical weight. He could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her lower lip that she fought to suppress with a bite of her teeth. She was lying, or at least concealing the truth, but she was doing it with the desperation of a woman who believed she had no other choice. To press her now, without the trunk opened or the grocer present, would yield nothing but denial. She would cling to her story until the walls closed in. His eyes drifted past her, landing on the corner of the room where a large trunk stood locked with a brass padlock. It was new, the leather still supple and unscratched, unlike the rest of the furniture which bore the scars of years. Whenever he spoke the name Brown, Gale's gaze flicked towards it, just for an instant, a betrayal of the nerve beneath the calm exterior. The trunk was heavy, sitting low on the floorboards as if weighted down by stones or flesh. "We will speak again," Proctor said finally, turning away from her. He forced his shoulders to relax, hiding the urge to stride over and pry the lid open with his own hands. Patience was a tool, sharper than any crowbar. "Do not leave the premises. A constable will remain outside." He walked back through the rooms, the smell of burnt bone lingering in his nostrils, heavier now that he knew what it was. The ribbon in his pocket felt like a lead weight against his chest, pulling at the fabric of his waistcoat. He had the physical evidence, the ash and the silk, but the living witness remained a locked door. He descended the stairs, the landlord watching from the shadows of the kitchen, arms crossed over an apron stained with grease and time. The man said nothing, merely tracking Proctor's movement with eyes that held no curiosity, only a dull resentment. Stepping back out into the grey afternoon, the fog thickened, swallowing the street lamps before they could be lit. The cold bit through his coat, seeking the old injury in his shoulder. A runner waited by the gate, breath pluming in the cold, holding a folded letter in his hand. The boy shuffled his feet on the pavement, impatient to be rid of the burden. "Message for you, Mr. Proctor," the boy said, thrusting the paper forward. "Just arrived from the Marsh Gate post, said it was urgent." Proctor took the letter. The envelope was of fine quality, the wax seal unbroken. He recognized the handwriting on the front before he even turned it over. It was Greenacre's hand, looping and precise, the ink still glossy. He broke the seal and unfolded the page, reading the first line by the fading light. The words mocked him, claiming innocence and laughing at the futility of the search. The grocer knew they had been here. He knew they had found the ash. And yet, he wrote, as if he were the one in control. Proctor crumpled the letter in his fist, the paper resisting, then yielding. He looked up at the window of the room where Sarah Gale sat, the single square of yellow light now glowing against the encroaching dark. She was watching him. He could feel her gaze through the glass, through the fog, through the layers of deceit that wrapped the house. He tucked the crumpled letter into his pocket, alongside the ribbon and the vial, and turned towards the canal. The water would tell the rest of the story. The steam from the coffee cup curled against the glass, obscuring the street below until Proctor wiped it clear with a thumb. Outside, the Hackney Road lay grey and unmoving, the fog clinging to the brickwork like wet wool. He had not gone to the canal. The letter from Greenacre could wait in his pocket, burning a hole through the fabric, because the woman in the lodging house mattered more than the man who wrote lies. If Gale meant to run, she would show herself now. Patience was a tool sharper than any crowbar, but it required a steady hand and a warm room. He sat in the corner of the establishment, where the shadows gathered thickest, nursing a brew that tasted of burnt chicory and ash. The landlord of the coffee house ignored him, busy polishing glasses that were already clean, wiping the same spot on the counter in a rhythmic, nervous circle. Proctor watched the reflection of the street in the mirror behind the bottles. A cart rumbled past, iron rims grinding on the sets, shaking the dust from the ceiling beams. Nothing else moved. Then she appeared. Sarah Gale stepped from the doorway of the lodging house, pulling a shawl tight around her shoulders. She did not look left or right. Her head bowed against the wind. She walked with the hurried shuffle of someone trying to disappear into the pavement. Proctor set the cup down. The china clicked against the saucer, a sharp sound in the quiet room. He waited until she had turned the corner before standing, dropping a coin on the table, and slipping out into the cold. Distance was safety. If she saw him, she would bolt or return to the room and the opportunity would rot. He kept to the opposite side of the street, blending with the few pedestrians braving the damp. Her figure was a dark smudge against the grey brick, moving steadily towards Shoreditch. She knew the way. This was not a flight of panic, but a planned errand. Proctor's shoulder throbbed where the old injury sat, a dull ache that flared when the air turned heavy. He ignored it. The pain was useful. It kept him awake. They passed a gin shop, the windows boarded up, and a chandler's store smelling of tallow and rendered fat. Gale did not slow. She turned into a narrower lane where the buildings leaned towards each other as if whispering secrets. Here the fog was thicker, trapping the smell of open drains and rotting vegetables. Proctor stopped at the entrance of the lane, letting her gain ground. He watched her pause before a shop with 3 brass balls hanging above the door. A pawnbroker. She entered. Proctor counted to 30, listening to the bell above the door chime in the distance, then followed. The shop interior was dim, lit by a single gas jet that hissed softly in the gloom. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with clothes, tools, and household goods, all pledged for silver that would never be seen again. The air smelled of mothballs and old dust. Gale stood at the counter, her back to him, speaking in a low voice to a man behind a wire grill. The pawnbroker was thin, his face pale and sharp, eyes darting between the woman and the object in her hand. Proctor waited near a rack of coats, fingering the sleeve of a wool jacket that felt rough and damp. He listened. "It is gold," Gale said. Her voice trembled just slightly. "I need the value." "Where did you come by it?" the pawnbroker asked. He did not touch the ring yet. "Name and address." "A gift." She pushed the item through the gap in the wire. "Does it matter where?" "In this trade, it matters a great deal." Picking up the ring with tweezers, the man held it to the light, squinting as he turned it over. "Hallmark looks fresh," he noted. "Too fresh for a gift given in hardship." Proctor stepped forward. The floorboard creaked under his weight. Both of them turned. Gale's face drained of color, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. She recognized him instantly. The fear in her eyes was not for the ring, but for what the ring represented. "Good morning," Proctor said. He kept his voice level, devoid of threat, though the air between them tightened. "I would advise against completing that transaction." The pawnbroker bristled, setting the tweezers down. "This is a private business, sir, if the lady wishes to pleasure." "The lady is under observation by Bow Street." Proctor moved to the counter, placing his hand flat on the wood. He did not look at Gale. He looked at the ring. It glinted in the gaslight, a simple band with a small setting. He knew the description. Hannah Brown's family had provided it weeks ago, a trivial thing worn by a woman now scattered across parishes. That item is evidence in a capital case. Gale recoiled, as if the counter had burned her, stepping back until her heel caught on the edge of the rug. "It was given to me," she whispered. "James gave it to me." "James Greenacre is not in a position to give gifts," Proctor said. He turned to the pawnbroker. "I will require a receipt for the attempt, and the item remains here." "I cannot just "You can, and you will." Proctor reached into his coat, pulling out his badge. The metal was cold against his palm. "Or I can close this premises until the magistrate arrives to discuss your diligence in handling stolen goods." The pawnbroker swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at Gale, then at Proctor, calculating the risk. He reached for a ledger, opening it to a fresh page. "Name?" he asked Proctor. "Thomas Proctor, Bow Street." The man wrote it down, the scratch of the pen loud in the silence. He slid the ring into a small paper packet and sealed it, handing it over along with the receipt. "Take it. I want no trouble." Proctor took the packet, the paper so thin it crinkled in his grip before he tucked it into his waistcoat, close to the heart. "You have done your duty," he said to the pawnbroker. Then he turned to Gale, who was shaking now as the shawl slipped from one shoulder. "Come with me, Mrs. Gale. We have much to discuss." She did not move. Her eyes were fixed on the packet in his hand, the place where the ring now lay. It was a small thing, a circle of gold, but it weighed more than the trunk in the lodging house. It was proof that she had touched the dead woman's life, that she had profited from the aftermath. Whether she knew of the murder was a question for the court, but this was possession. "The constable outside," Proctor said softly. "He will escort you." "I have done nothing wrong," she said. The words were automatic, a reflex learned on the streets. "We shall see." Proctor gestured towards the door. Walk ahead of me." She turned, moving slowly, as if the air had turned to syrup. Proctor followed, watching the line of her back, the tension in her shoulders. The fog outside had not lifted. It waited for them, thick and grey, ready to swallow the street whole. He touched the packet in his waistcoat again, ensuring it was secure. The ring was safe. The law had its hook. Now he needed to see if she would pull the rest of the line in. The paper packet sat heavy in Proctor's waistcoat pocket, pressing against his ribs with every step of the return journey. He walked beside the constable who escorted Gale, neither of them speaking, the only sound the wet slap of boots on the pavement and the distant, mournful cry of a costermonger hawking wilted greens from a barrow. The fog had thickened since noon, clinging to the wool of Proctor's coat like a second skin, dampening the gas lamps until they were mere smudges of sulphur yellow in the gloom. He kept his gaze forward, avoiding the glance of the woman walking ahead, her shawl pulled tight around her head as though it might shield her from the law itself. They reached the lodging house in Hackney Road without incident. The constable ushered Gale inside, up the narrow stairs that smelled of boiled cabbage and stale tobacco, into the small parlour where the investigation had begun. Proctor followed, closing the door against the draught that whistled through the sash window. The room was dim, lit by a single gas jet that hissed softly, casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper. A table stood in the center, scarred with knife marks and ring stains from previous tenants, a wooden island in a sea of worn carpet. Proctor removed his hat and placed it on the sideboard. He did not sit. Standing gave him height, leverage, the slight advantage of a man who controls the space. He reached into his waistcoat and withdrew the packet from the pawnbroker. The paper crinkled, a sharp sound in the quiet room. Gale sat on a straight-backed chair near the fire, her hands clasped in her lap, knuckles white. She did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the grate, where a few coals glowed faintly, offering no warmth. He placed the receipt on the table between them. The ink was still wet in places, shining black under the gaslight. "You know what that is," Proctor said. His voice was low, stripped of theatrical flourish. Gale's throat worked. She swallowed, a visible contraction of muscle beneath the skin. "It is a receipt. For a ring you did not own. James gave it to me." The words came out too quickly, tumbling over one another. She lifted her head then, meeting his eyes for the first time since the pawnshop. There was no defiance in her look, only a desperate, animal plea. "He said it was a gift. For my birthday. I told you this already." Proctor leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the table where the wood felt cold under his palms. "Mr. Greenacre is a grocer, a man of commerce who keeps ledgers. He tracks every ounce of sugar and every pound of flour." After a pause that let the image of the shop settle in the air between them, he spoke again. "Men like him do not give away gold unless they are buying silence." "It was a gift." Her voice dropped to a whisper. She looked back at the fire. "Then why pawn it?" Proctor straightened, moving around the table until he stood closer to her. He could smell the damp wool of her shawl, the faint scent of lavender water that had long since faded. If it was a token of affection, why turn it into silver at the first opportunity, unless you needed funds, unless you were preparing to leave? Gale shifted in the chair, her foot tapping a nervous rhythm against the leg, as she explained that she needed money for provisions since the shop was closed and they had nothing in the house. "There was money in the till at the shop. I saw the ledger myself this morning." Proctor watched her hands. They were trembling now, a fine vibration that she tried to suppress by clenching them tighter. "You are lying, Mrs. Gale, and you are lying poorly." She flinched. The words struck her like a physical blow. She turned her face away, towards the window where the fog pressed against the glass, opaque and suffocating. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The gas jet hissed, a snake in the wall. Proctor waited. He knew the pressure of silence better than the pressure of questions. It was in the quiet that the truth often slipped out, unguarded. "I have a boy," she said. The words were so soft he almost missed them. Proctor stilled. He had heard rumors, whispers from the neighbors about a child kept hidden, but nothing confirmed. "Where is he?" "Safe." She wiped her hand across her mouth, smudging the skin. "Away from here," James said. "He said if I spoke, the boy would suffer." "The boy is not here." "He knows where I am." Her eyes snapped back to Proctor, wide and wet. You think I do not know what he is capable of? You think I do not see the things he brings into this house? The parcels, the smell, she shuddered, a full-body recoil that shook the chair beneath her. I took the ring because I needed to run, not from you, from him. Proctor studied her face. The lines around her mouth were deep, carved by worry and lack of sleep. He saw the fear there, raw and unmasked. It was not the fear of a conspirator caught in the act, but the fear of a trapped animal knowing the predator still roams free. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the weight of cases past where the women were merely collateral damage in a man's violence. He wanted to believe her. Duty demanded he treat her as an accessory, yet his instinct whispered that she was another victim waiting for the drop. Greenacre is not here, Proctor said. He has fled. I told you. She slumped back into the chair, the tension draining out of her, leaving her hollow. He said he had business in Birmingham. He left yesterday. He left a trail. Proctor tapped the receipt on the table. And you are part of it. He stepped back from the table, putting distance between them. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the unspoken history of the violence done to Hannah Brown. He could not afford pity. Not yet. The law required evidence, not empathy, and Gale's testimony would be needed to hang the man who truly deserved the rope. You will remain here, Proctor said. Under guard. Do not attempt to leave. Do not attempt to speak to anyone. What will happen to me? Her voice was flat. That depends on what you tell me when I return. Proctor moved to the door, his hand on the latch. He paused, looking back at her one last time. The gaslight flickered, casting her shadow large against the wall, a distorted shape that seemed to loom over the small woman in the chair. If Greenacre is caught, your cooperation will be noted. If he is not. He did not finish the sentence. He opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, closing it softly behind him. The constable waited outside, leaning against the plaster. Proctor nodded to him, a sharp, single movement. Watch her, Proctor said. No one in, no one out. And the man, the constable asked, Greenacre. Proctor adjusted his coat, feeling the absence of the packet in his pocket where the ring had been. The evidence was secure at Bow Street now, logged and sealed. The ring was a hook, but Greenacre was the fish. He could feel the killer's movements in his bones, the erratic flight of a man who believed distance could erase guilt. Birmingham was a lie. A man with blood on his hands does not flee to a city of factories. He hides in the shadows of the capital until the heat dies down. He is in London, Proctor said. He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. And I know where he will go next. He descended the stairs, his boots striking the wood with purpose. The street outside waited, dark and wet, the fog swirling around the gas lamps like smoke. There was a shop on Edgware Road that needed searching, a ledger that needed reading. The night was young, and the dead woman's remains were still waiting for their name. Proctor stepped onto the pavement, turning his collar up against the damp. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun. The shop on Edgware Road stood shuttered, a blind face turned against the street, its windows painted over with lime to hide the emptiness within. Proctor did not bother knocking. He signaled to the two constables trailing him, men whose breath plumed white in the freezing air, and they stepped forward with a crowbar wrapped in rag to mute the strike. The wood splintered with a dry crack, loud enough to startle a stray dog scavenging near the gutter, but no light flickered inside. No voice called out. Just the settling of dust and the heavy, stagnant smell of spices left to rot in their sacks. They pushed through the broken frame into a darkness that felt solid, pressing against the eyes. Light, Proctor ordered. One of the constables struck a lucifer match, the sulfur flare hissing before catching the wick of a candle stub found on the counter. The flames sputtered, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across shelves stripped bare of tea and sugar. Only the dregs remained, scattered like gravel on the floorboards. Proctor moved past them, his boots crunching on spilled peppercorns and dried cloves, the scent sharp and cloying in the cold air. It smelled of a life interrupted, of commerce abandoned mid-transaction. He made for the back room, the place where a grocer kept his accounts, his private ledger of debts and credits. The door hung ajar, swollen with damp. Inside, a small grate held the grey ashes of a fire recently extinguished, the embers dead and cold to the touch. On the desk sat a book, or what remained of one. Proctor leaned in, the candlelight flickering over the charred edges. Someone had tried to burn it, feeding pages into the grate with haste, but the fire had died too quickly, perhaps starved of air or kindling. Half the book survived, the leather cover warped and blackened, the pages brittle as dried leaves. He gloved his hands in a handkerchief and turned the leaves, careful not to let them crumble into dust. Names, dates, sums. Most were illegible, reduced to brown scorch marks and holes that revealed the blank page beneath. But here and there, the ink held, defiant against the flame. He traced a line with a finger, squinting against the dancing light. Feb 1, cart hire, to Hampstead. Feb 2, box, large, nail and rope. Feb 3, journey, Birmingham. The word Birmingham jumped out, underlined twice with a nervous, heavy hand. Proctor paused, his breath catching in his throat. It was a destination, a planned route, written with the desperation of a man trying to convince himself of an escape. But the date was tomorrow, or perhaps today if the clock had already turned. He means to run, Proctor murmured, the words barely audible over the settling of the building, not to hide, but to vanish. Sir, the constable shifted behind him, the floorboard creaking under his weight. Find anything of use. Enough to hang him if we are quick. Proctor straightened, his back protesting the stoop. He looked around the room, his eyes adjusting to the gloom beyond the candle's reach. Crates were stacked in the corner, empty, their lids thrown aside. A coat hook on the wall stood bare, missing the heavy greatcoat a man would need for a journey north in February. He has not left yet, not fully. He is gathering what he needs. Birmingham is a long way, the constable noted, wiping soot from his nose. Plenty of places to stop between here and there. A man with blood on his hands does not stop, Proctor said, turning back to the ledger. He studied the handwriting, the sharp angles of the letters, the pressure of the pen that had nearly torn the paper. It was the script of a man in a fever, writing faster than his thoughts could form. He believes distance will wash it away, that if he can put enough miles between himself and the parcel, the law will lose the scent. He closed the book gently, treating the burnt artifact with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. This was the map, not of a trade route, but of a flight. Greenacre thought he was clever, scattering his tracks, burning his bridges, but he had left this behind, a mistake born of panic. Take this, Proctor commanded, handing the ledger to the constable. Wrap it in oilcloth, do not let it get wet, do not let it break. And the shop, sir, shall we secure it? Leave it, Proctor said, moving towards the door. The air outside called to him, cold and sharp, promising movement. Let the thieves have the spices, we have bigger game. They stepped back out onto the pavement, the fog wrapping around them like a damp shroud. The gas lamps along Edgware Road burned low, their light diffused by the mist into pale, sickly halos. Carriages rumbled past, the wheels heavy on the wet stones, splashing mud onto the curb. Proctor ignored the filth, his mind racing ahead of his feet. Birmingham. It was a lie, surely, or at least a decoy. A man like Greenacre would not head straight for a major city where the magistrates were alert and the coaches were watched. He would go to ground first, finding a hole in the outskirts, a farmhouse or a lonely inn where he could wait for the heat to die down. But the ledger said Birmingham, and Greenacre was a creature of habit, a grocer who trusted his lists and his plans. He might stick to the script, believing his own fiction. Proctor pulled his collar up, shielding his neck from the biting wind. He needed to reach Bow Street. He needed to send riders to the coaching inns, to Islington, to King's Cross, anywhere a northbound stage might depart. Time was slipping away, granular and relentless, like sand through a broken hourglass. Constable, he said, breaking the silence that had grown between them as they walked. When you deliver the ledger, tell Inspector Hean to put men on the Birmingham Mail, and the Worcester, and the Liverpool, any coach leaving before dawn. All of them, sir, that will stretch the men thin. Better thin than absent, Proctor snapped, his patience fraying like old rope. If Greenacre boards a coach, he must be taken before the wheels turn. Do you understand me? Before. The constable nodded, quick and sharp, sensing the shift in his superior's mood. Aye, sir, I'll see it done. They parted at the corner, the constable hurrying off towards the station while Proctor turned towards the main thoroughfare. The street was quieter now, the late-night drinkers having retreated to their homes or their cells. Only the watchmen remained, tapping their staffs on the stones, their calls echoing hollowly in the mist. Past 2 o'clock and a cloudy morning. Proctor walked faster, his stride eating up the pavement. He could feel the presence of the killer in the air, a tangible pressure, as if Greenacre were walking just ahead of him, invisible in the fog. The man was terrified. He had to be. No one could dismantle a woman, scatter her pieces across the parishes, and sleep soundly while the net tightened. The fear would make him sloppy. It would make him predictable. A hansom cab clattered past, the horse's hooves striking sparks from the flint in the road. Proctor raised a hand, and the driver pulled up, the leather springs groaning under the sudden stop. "Bow Street," Proctor said, climbing in before the cabman could offer a fare. "And drive as if the devil himself were on your axle." The whip cracked, the horse lunged forward, and the cab swayed into the flow of the night. Proctor sat back, the wooden seat hard against his spine, and closed his eyes for a moment. The image of the burnt ledger floated behind his eyelids, the word Birmingham burning brighter than the rest. It was a thread, fragile and singed, but it was a thread nonetheless. If he pulled it hard enough, the whole tapestry might unravel. But as the cab rattled over the stones, a new thought intruded, cold and unwelcome. What if Birmingham was not the destination, but the diversion? What if Greenacre was not running north at all, but circling back, hiding in the very shadows Proctor had just left? The cab turned a corner, the wheels squealing, and Proctor opened his eyes, staring into the dense, impenetrable fog. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the empty space where the ring receipt had been, now safely filed away. He needed more. He needed a sight, a witness, anything to confirm the direction of the flight. The driver leaned down through the hatch, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. "Saw a fellow earlier, governor," he shouted over the noise of the wheels. "Near the Swan, loading a trunk onto the Manchester coach. Looked mighty anxious, he did, kept checking his watch and looking over his shoulder." Proctor sat up, the sudden motion jarring his shoulders. What time? 10 minutes past, maybe quarter. Tall bloke, dark coat, carried the box himself, wouldn't let the porter touch it. The description fit the trunk, the anxiety, and the refusal to let go of the burden. "Change of plan," Proctor barked, rapping on the roof. "The Swan, King's Cross, go." The cab swerved violently, nearly clipping a post, as the driver urged the horse into a gallop. The fog tore past them, a grey river flowing in reverse. Proctor gripped the side of the cab, his knuckles white, his heart hammering a rhythm that matched the pounding of the hooves. The Manchester coach, not Birmingham, close enough to confuse the trail, but different enough to slip the net if the focus was too narrow. Greenacre was moving, the bird was flushing, and Proctor was finally, after all these days of shadow and silence, in full pursuit. The carriage lurched over a rut, throwing him against the opposite seat, but he did not flinch. He only watched the dark shapes of the buildings rushing by, counting the seconds, measuring the distance between justice and escape. The leather strap refused the buckle. Proctor yanked it hard, the brass tongue catching on the worn edge before snapping home with a dull click that sounded too loud in the empty room. His valise sat open on the bed, a gaping maw of dark cowhide swallowing the tools of his trade. Inside lay the depositions, stacked and tied with red tape that had faded to the color of dried blood, alongside the sealed packet containing the sketch of Greenacre's hand. He did not pack a change of shirt. The wool he wore would hold the scent of the road soon enough, and clean linen felt like a lie when chasing a man who had turned a woman into parcels. Outside, the yard at Bow Street breathed a slow, wet rhythm. Horses stamped, their hooves striking the cobbles with a hollow ring that traveled up through the floorboards and into the soles of Proctor's boots. He lifted the valise, feeling the weight of the paper press against his palm, heavier than the clothes he left behind. Justice was a heavy thing to carry north. It dragged at the shoulder, the same one where the truncheon blow from 31 had left its permanent, aching ghost. He adjusted the coat, pulling the collar up against the draft that slipped through the sash window, and stepped out into the corridor. The mail coach waited in the street, a monstrous beast of varnished wood and iron-rimmed wheels, steaming in the cold air. Condensation dripped from the horse's flanks, mixing with the mud that coated the lower panels of the carriage. A guard blew a long, mournful note on his horn, the sound tearing through the lingering fog and scattering a group of pigeons from the roof of the nearby inn. Passengers scrambled to board, a flurry of cloaks and valises and hurried goodbyes, their faces flushed with the excitement of travel or the fear of being left behind. They spoke of markets in Manchester, of wool prices in Leeds, of cousins waiting with hot suppers. None of them looked at the man in the grey coat who stood apart, watching the wheels with the stillness of a tombstone. Proctor handed his ticket to the guard, a burly man with a face like cured ham. "Inside?" the guard asked, jerking his thumb towards the cramped cabin. "Aye," Proctor said, "and keep the door shut once we move. I've no taste for the wind tonight." "Wind's the least of it, governor, for the road's foul past Barnet with ice under the muck." The guard spat into the gutter. The globule landed with a soft splash. "You'll feel every rut." "I've felt worse." He climbed in, the leather step groaning under his weight. The interior smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of the lantern oil that flickered in the brass holder above. Two other passengers already occupied the bench opposite. A merchant in a beaver hat, clutching a sample case to his chest as if it contained the crown jewels, and a woman wrapped in shawls so thick only her eyes were visible, dark and watchful. They fell silent as Proctor settled himself, the springs squeaking in protest. The merchant nodded, a polite, jerky movement, then returned his gaze to his hands. The woman did not move at all. The door slammed, the lock engaged with a heavy clunk that severed them from the street. For a moment, there was only the sound of breathing and the distant shout of the coachman urging the team forward. Then the wheels began to turn, a low rumble that quickly built into a thunderous clatter as the coach lurched onto the main thoroughfare. Proctor was thrown against the side, his shoulder jamming into the woodwork. He righted himself, ignoring the merchant's muttered apology, and reached into his pocket. His fingers found the folded paper there. He drew it out, careful not to crease the edges further, and held it up to the lantern's sickly yellow glow. The flame danced, casting wild shadows that made the ink on the page seem to writhe. It was a copy of a letter, intercepted from a lodging house in Holborn before Greenacre had vanished into the ether. The handwriting was precise, looped, unnervingly elegant for a man who currently had a noose waiting for him at Newgate. "My dear Sarah," it began, the words flowing together like water over smooth stones. Proctor traced the line with a thumb stained by soot and ink. He had read this sheet 100 times until the meaning had dissolved into mere shape, but now, moving away from the city that bred the crime, the words took on a new texture. They were not just evidence. They were a map of a mind that could order a death and then inquire after the health of a cousin in the very next sentence. The coach hit a pothole, jolting violently. The merchant cursed, clutching his case tighter, while the woman merely swayed, her eyes never leaving Proctor's face. He ignored them both, folding the letter back along its original creases. The rhythm of the wheels settled into a hypnotic beat, a constant rattling that seemed to shake the thoughts loose from his skull. London was receding. He could feel it in the changing quality of the light outside the window, the gas lamps growing fewer, the darkness between them stretching longer and deeper. Soon the glow would vanish entirely, replaced by the black void of the countryside, where the law held less sway than the whim of a local magistrate or the strength of a runner's arm. He leaned back, the wood digging into his spine. The want was simple, sharp as a needle, to close the distance before Greenacre could secure a passage to the coast. Every mile gained by the coach was a mile stolen from the killer, but the obstacle sat in the silence of the cabin, in the limitations of his own reach. He was a Bow Street runner, a creature of the parish, of the specific streets he knew by the smell of their drains and the crack of their pavements. Out here in the shifting dark between towns, he was just a man with a piece of paper and a warrant that might be questioned by a sleepy justice of the peace more interested in his own bed than in a London murder. The merchant cleared his throat, the sound dry and abrasive. "Bad business, this weather," he said, his voice trying to find purchase in the small space. "Frost'll set in proper by midnight, make the going treacherous." Proctor did not look up. "The road will hold." One hopes. Had a cousin lose a wheel near Dunstable last winter, near turned the whole coach over. The merchant shifted, the silk of his waistcoat rustling. "Travel alone, do you, on such a night?" "Work," Proctor said. The word was flat, a stone dropped into a well. "Ah, commerce," the merchant nodded, satisfied with the lie he had constructed for himself. Nothing stops the wheels of trade, not even the fog. Proctor said nothing. He watched the shadow of the lantern swing above them, a pendulum marking time they did not have. The woman shifted finally, pulling her shawl tighter around her chin. Her eyes met his, and for a second he saw a flicker of recognition, not of his face, but of his purpose. She knew a hunter when she saw one, perhaps because she had spent her life being hunted by men less scrupulous than the law. She looked away quickly, staring out the window at the passing dark. The coach picked up speed, the horses finding their stride on the smoother stretch of pavement leading out of the metropolis. The buildings thinned, replaced by the skeletal shapes of trees that whipped past in a blur of grey and black. Proctor closed his eyes, letting the vibration of the carriage travel up through his bones. He memorized the feel of the letter in his pocket, the rough texture of the paper against his thigh. It was his anchor. As long as he held that truth, the distance did not matter. The fog, the ice, the indifference of the country magistrates, they were just noise. The signal was clear. Greenacre was running, and Proctor was coming. But as the rhythm of the wheels drilled into his skull, a cold doubt began to seep in, quiet and persistent. Greenacre was a grocer, a man of accounts and ledgers, of careful measurements and balanced books. He did not run on impulse. If he was heading north, it was because he wanted to be followed, or because the north offered something London did not. Proctor opened his eyes, staring at the opposite bench where the merchant had finally dozed off, his head lolling against the leather squab. The woman was still awake, watching the dark. Proctor touched the pocket where the letter lay. He had the evidence. He had the direction, but he did not have the man, not yet. And until he felt the heat of Greenacre's arm under his hand, until he saw the fear break that polished mask, the journey was just a ride into the unknown. The coach plunged into a dip, throwing them all forward, and Proctor gripped the seat, his knuckles white, waiting for the road to reveal what the city had hidden. Birmingham air tasted of coal dust and wet iron, a grit that coated the back of the throat before Proctor had even stepped down from the coach box. The dawn was a grey smear against the brickwork, offering no warmth, only a dull illumination of the canal basin where barges sat low in the water, laden with pig iron that would soon be forged into tools or rails. He adjusted his collar against the damp, the wool scratchy and stiff from the journey, and felt the familiar ache in his left shoulder where the old truncheon blow remembered every shift in the weather. This was not London. The streets here were wider, the buildings less huddled, yet the smoke hung just as low, a ceiling of soot that trapped the noise of the town. He found the magistrate's clerk in a room that smelled of stale tobacco and ink, a man with spectacles perched on the end of a nose that had seen too many papers and not enough sun. The clerk looked up, his pen hovering over a ledger, when Proctor placed his credentials on the desk. The leather badge of Bow Street caught the light from the single window, dull but undeniable. "London business," the clerk said, his voice flat, lacking the sing-song cadence of the capital. "We have our own constables, sir. Matters of murder usually stay within the parish where the body is found, or so the act suggests." "The body is in pieces," Proctor said, his voice low, stripping the sentiment from the fact. "And the man who cut them is yours to hold if he crosses your threshold. I have a warrant for James Greenacre. He is believed to be heading north, possibly through this town, possibly seeking passage on a canal boat." The clerk blinked, the pen dipping slightly. "Greenacre, the grocer from the papers, they say he vanished with a woman's trunk." "They say many things. I say he is a murderer with a head start of 12 hours and a knowledge of how to blend into a crowd." Proctor unfolded the letter he had carried since leaving Holborn, the paper crackling in the quiet room. He smoothed it flat, the loops of Greenacre's handwriting stark against the cream stock. "He writes to an accomplice in London. He speaks of Birmingham as a place of refuge, of friends in the trade." The clerk leaned forward, squinting at the script. The reluctance in his posture shifted, replaced by a grim curiosity. In 1837, a dismemberment was not merely a crime. It was an affront to the order of things, a chaos that threatened the delicate balance of a society trying to convince itself of its own civility. "If he is here," the clerk said, tapping the desk with the end of his pen, "he will not stay in the open. The inns near the canal are the likely spots. The Swan, perhaps, or the smaller houses down by the lock gates where questions are not asked." "Post notices," Proctor said. "Describe him. 5'9", dark hair, precise in his dress. He carries himself like a man of means, not a fugitive. That is his mask. We can alert the constables, but you understand, Mr. Proctor, our men are stretched thin. The riots last year left scars, and the watch is wary of strangers waving warrants from London. I do not need an army, Proctor replied. I need eyes, and I need to walk the streets myself. The clerk nodded, a sharp jerk of the chin. Do what you must, but keep the peace while you do it. We have enough trouble without a London runner turning the town upside down. Proctor left the office and stepped back into the street, the noise of Birmingham washing over him. Carts rumbled on iron-rimmed wheels, horses snorted steam into the chill air, and men in aprons shouted orders across the cobbles. He walked with a steady pace, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the passers-by, looking for the specific tension of a man who knows he is being hunted. Greenacre was a creature of habit, a man who balanced his books and measured his sugar with exacting care. He would not sleep in a hovel. He would seek respectability, even in flight. Swan Inn was a large establishment near the centre, its sign creaking in the wind, but Proctor felt a pull towards the smaller houses near the water. The smell of the canal was stronger here, a mix of stagnant water, oil and decay that reminded him too sharply of the parcels found in the Regent's Canal back in London. He stopped outside a lodging house with a faded blue door, the paint peeling to reveal the rotting wood beneath. A woman was sweeping the step, her movements rhythmic and tired. Looking for someone? She asked, not stopping her work. The broom bristles scraped against the stone. A gentleman, Proctor said, travelling alone, arrived yesterday evening, might have paid in advance. The woman paused, leaning on the broom handle. She looked him up and down, assessing the cut of his coat, the stain of travel on his boots. Gentlemen don't usually come here unless they want to be unseen. This one had reason to be unseen. She spat on the step, a small, dark mark. There was a man, took the room at the back, overlooking the water, paid for 3 nights, said he was waiting for goods from Manchester. Did he give a name? Said it was Smith, but his hands, she stopped, frowning as if trying to recall a texture. His hands were too soft for a merchant, and he checked the lock on his door 3 times before I left him. Proctor felt a tightening in his chest, a sudden clarity cutting through the fatigue. Which room? Top floor, end of the hall. She resumed sweeping, the rhythm faster now. You're the law, aren't you? I saw the way you stood, like you were waiting for a fight. Just a word, Proctor said. He moved past her, pushing open the door. The hallway was dark, smelling of boiled cabbage and damp plaster. He climbed the stairs, his footsteps silent on the worn runner. At the top, the corridor was narrow, a single window at the far end casting a pale light on the closed door of the end room. He stood before it, listening. Silence, no movement, no breathing. He knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the narrow space. Who is it? The voice from inside was calm, modulated, devoid of panic. It was the voice of a man discussing the price of tea, not a man facing the gallows. Thomas Proctor, Bow Street. Open the door, Mr. Greenacre. A pause, then the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door opened, and James Greenacre stood there, dressed in a dark coat that was brushed clean of travel dust, his cravat tied with precise symmetry. He looked at Proctor, then at the 2 local constables who had silently appeared at the bottom of the stairs and now climbed to flank the runner. I was expecting someone, Greenacre said, a faint smile touching his lips. Though I hoped it might be my solicitor, still, one must take what comes. You are under arrest for the murder of Hannah Brown, Proctor said, stepping forward. He reached out, his hand closing over Greenacre's arm. The muscle beneath the wool was tense, coiled, but the man did not pull away. Murder, Greenacre repeated, the word rolling around his mouth as if tasting it. Such a harsh term for a matter of commerce. But come, Mr. Proctor, if we must go, let us go with dignity. The street is watching. Proctor guided him out, the constables falling in behind. As they descended the stairs, Greenacre glanced at the woman sweeping the step, nodding politely as if he were merely leaving a business meeting. She stopped sweeping, watching them pass, her eyes wide. The trap had closed, clean and sudden. But as Proctor marched the killer towards the waiting carriage, he felt no triumph, only the heavy, cold weight of the journey back to London, where the gallows waited and the questions would begin anew. Greenacre hummed a tune under his breath, something light and trivial, as the wheels of the carriage began to turn, carrying them back to the city of smoke and judgment. The bolt slid back with a dry scrape, metal biting against wood, and the door swung inward to reveal a sliver of lamplight cutting across the hallway floor. James Greenacre stood framed in the aperture, his silhouette sharp against the gloom of the room behind him, dressed not in the rumpled rags of a fugitive, but in a coat of dark wool brushed free of travel dust. His cravat was tied with a symmetry that mocked the chaos of the chase, the white linen stark against his throat, while his hands rested loosely at his sides, palms open as if awaiting a shipment of sugar rather than the law. "Mr. Proctor," he said, the voice smooth, devoid of the tremor that might betray a man cornered. "I confess, I expected the local constabulary first. They do move with such deliberate slowness in this town." Proctor did not answer immediately. He stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and placed a hand on the man's upper arm. The muscle beneath the fine fabric was tense, a coiled spring held in check by sheer will, yet Greenacre did not flinch or attempt to pull away. Behind the runner, the two Birmingham constables crowded the narrow landing, their breath heavy in the cold air, their truncheons drawn but held low, unsure of the protocol for capturing a gentleman. "You are under arrest for the murder of Hannah Brown," Proctor said, the words flat and final, stripped of any theatrical flourish. "Anything you say now may be used against you when we stand before the magistrate." Greenacre tilted his head, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, an expression that did not reach his eyes. "Murder, such a brutal word for a matter of commerce, is it not? A debt settled, a ledger balanced. But come, Mr. Proctor, let us not make a spectacle in the hallway. The walls are thin, and I have always valued my reputation for discretion." He turned back into the room, moving with a casual grace that seemed to unnerve the local constables more than any resistance would have. Proctor followed him inside, the smell of the room hitting him instantly, a cloying mix of stale tobacco, cheap soap, and something sharper, metallic, like old pennies left in the rain. A valise sat open on the bed, clothes folded with military precision, while a hat brush lay on the washstand, its bristles still damp. "There is no need for irons," Greenacre said, picking up his hat from the table and brushing a speck of invisible lint from the brim. "I am not a common thief, nor a runaway debtor. I am a man of business who finds himself misunderstood by the courts. We shall go quietly, and you shall have your warrant signed before the sun sets." Proctor watched him, the silence stretching between them, heavy with the unspoken weight of the parcels waiting in London, the fragments of bone and flesh that told a story far grimmer than Greenacre's polite euphemisms. He nodded to the constables, who moved to flank the prisoner, their presence filling the small space, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. "Move," Proctor said, his voice low. They descended the stairs, Greenacre walking with a measured pace, his boots clicking softly on the worn runner. At the bottom, the woman with the broom had stopped her work, leaning against the wall, her eyes wide as she watched the procession pass. Greenacre paused, turning to her with a slight bow, the gesture so automatic it felt like a reflex. "Good day, Mrs." He trailed off, waiting. "Higgins," she whispered, gripping the broom handle until her knuckles turned white. "Mrs. Higgins," Greenacre repeated, nodding. "Thank you for your hospitality." The room was adequate, though the view lacked a certain vibrancy. He turned back to Proctor, the smile returning, colder this time. "Shall we? The carriage awaits, I presume. One hates to keep the law waiting, even when the law is mistaken." Outside, the air was biting, the wind whipping off the canal and carrying the scent of wet coal and iron ore. A black carriage stood at the curb, the horses stamping impatiently, their breath pluming in the grey light. Proctor guided Greenacre towards it, his grip on the man's arm firm, feeling the solid reality of the capture settling over him, yet offering no relief, no surge of triumph. It was merely a step, a necessary movement in a long, grim dance that would end only when the drop fell at Newgate. Greenacre climbed into the carriage with assistance, arranging his coat around his legs, as if preparing for a leisurely journey to the countryside. Proctor followed, sliding onto the seat opposite him, the leather cold and stiff beneath him. The constables remained outside, closing the door with a solid thud that sealed them in a box of shadows and the rhythmic creak of the suspension. As the wheels began to turn, jolting them forward onto the cobbles, Greenacre looked out the window, watching the industrial sprawl of Birmingham blur past. "You know, Mr. Proctor," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur barely audible over the clatter of the hooves. "Sarah Gale is a resilient woman. She has always known how to survive the storms I bring." Proctor stiffened, his gaze locking onto the killer's profile. "What do you mean?" Greenacre turned, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, a spark of something dark and amused dancing within them. "I mean that the ledger is not yet closed. There are entries she has yet to explain, debts she has yet to settle. You have caught me, yes, but do not think for a moment that you have caught the whole of this truth." The carriage lurched over a rut, throwing them briefly against the seats, but Greenacre merely adjusted his cravat, his composure unshaken. Proctor said nothing, the silence in the carriage growing heavy, charged with the implication hanging between them like a blade. The road to London stretched out before them, long and unforgiving, and for the first time since the chase began, Proctor felt the cold creep of doubt, a whisper that the capture of the man was only the beginning of a far more complicated reckoning. The wheels locked, iron shrieked against granite sets. Newgate loomed above them, a black mass against the bruised sky of late afternoon. Proctor pushed the carriage door open before the footman could reach it, his boot finding the muddy curb with a splash that sent cold water up the leg of his trousers. He ignored it. The damp was already in the wool of his coat, in the marrow of his shoulders, a permanent residence he had stopped trying to evict. Greenacre stepped out without assistance. He smoothed the front of his waistcoat, eyes sweeping across the facade of the prison as if appraising the stock of a competing grocer. "Charming," Greenacre said. "One trusts the ventilation is adequate. I have a constitution sensitive to stagnation." "Move," Proctor said. The great doors groaned inward. The smell hit them first, a wall of stale air, unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of cheap beer soaking into stone dust. It was a scent that clung to the back of the throat, oily and persistent. A turnkey waited in the gloom, a heavy ring of keys at his belt that chimed when he shifted his weight. He was a broad man, face pitted by smallpox, wearing a coat that had seen more winters than Proctor cared to count. "Name," the turnkey asked, not looking at Greenacre, but at the paper in Proctor's hand. "James Greenacre, committed for trial, capital charge." The turnkey nodded, extending a hand for the warrant. His fingers were stained with ink and something darker, perhaps rust, perhaps dried blood from a previous intake. Proctor handed it over. The transaction felt trivial, a slip of paper exchanging hands while a man's life tilted towards the drop. "Strip him," the turnkey said to the two guards who materialized from the shadows. Greenacre stiffened. "I protest. I am a gentleman awaiting trial, not a convicted felon to be scourged by your conditions." "Standard procedure," Proctor said, his voice flat. "You know the law better than most, Mr. Greenacre. Do not make this difficult." They took Greenacre's coat, his hat, the fine leather boots that had clicked so confidently on the carriage floor. He stood in his shirt sleeves, shivering slightly despite the bravado. The turnkey produced a pair of irons. Steel clicked around Greenacre's wrists, the sound sharp and final in the corridor. Greenacre watched the process, his jaw tightening, a muscle feathering near the ear. He said nothing as the lock snapped shut. "Cell 4, the turnkey said. "Bottom tier. No visitors without a magistrate's order." "Isolate him," Proctor added. "He is not to speak with anyone. No notes, no messages passed through the walls, especially no contact regarding a woman named Gale." The turnkey looked up, eyes narrowing. "Gale, the one at liberty?" "The same." "We'll keep him quiet," the turnkey said. "But walls have ears in here, Mr. Proctor. You know how it is. A coin buys a lot of silence or a lot of noise." "Ensure it buys silence." Proctor followed them down the corridor. The floor was slick with moisture, reflecting the flicker of the gas jets mounted on the walls. Shadows stretched long and thin, dancing like hanged men on the stone. Greenacre walked between the guards, the chain between his wrists rattling with each step. He did not look at Proctor. He looked at the cells they passed, peering into the darkness where other men waited for their own reckonings. "Sarah," Greenacre said suddenly, the voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "She has the ring, you know." Proctor stopped. The guards halted with him, hands resting on the prisoner's arms. "What ring?" "The one I gave her, gold, with a setting of pearls. She wears it still." Greenacre turned his head, a smile touching his lips that did not reach his eyes. "It fits her well, though perhaps it is too heavy for a finger so slender." "Take him," Proctor said. They moved on. The cell door opened with a grind of metal on stone. Greenacre was shoved inside. He stumbled, but regained his balance immediately, turning to face the bars. "You should ask her where she was on the 23rd, Greenacre called out as the door began to swing shut. "Ask her about the trunk. Ask her about Thea." The door slammed, the lock turned. The voice was cut off as if severed by a knife. Proctor stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the receding footsteps of the guards. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. He turned to the turnkey. "Paperwork," Proctor said. They went back to the office. A candle sputtered on the desk, casting a weak light over the ledgers stacked in precarious piles. Proctor took the quill offered to him. The nib was scratched, catching on the rough paper. He signed his name, the ink spreading slightly into the fibers. Thomas Proctor. The letters looked shaky. He steadied his hand and signed again where required. "He will try to communicate," Proctor said, dipping the quill again. "He is clever with words, turns them like a card sharper." "They don't get far," the turnkey said, blowing on the wet ink to dry it. "Most end up in the fire or the pockets of the guards. We know the type." "Make sure this one ends in the fire." Proctor capped the inkwell. The fatigue hit him then, a physical weight pressing down on his spine. He had not slept properly in 3 days. The face of Hannah Brown floated in his mind, not as she was in life, but as she was now, reconstructed by the surgeons, a puzzle of flesh that refused to stay whole. He pushed the thought away. It was not useful, not yet. "Will you need the cell key?" the turnkey asked. "No, keep him secure. I return for the trial." Proctor walked out of the office. The air in the main hall was colder than the office, carrying the draft from the street outside. He passed the cells again. Some men pressed their faces to the bars, eyes bright with desperation, begging for news, for tobacco, for a word of hope. Proctor kept his eyes forward. He could not afford their hunger. It would slow him down. Outside, the fog had thickened. Gas lamps on the street corner struggled against the gloom, halos of weak yellow light that failed to penetrate the gloom. A hansom cab rattled past. The driver huddled under a coat, whip cracking softly to urge the horse on. Proctor pulled his collar up against the damp. He needed to see the remains. The surgeons would be waiting at the dead house near the canal. The evidence had to be perfect. Greenacre's words about the ring nagged at him, a burr caught in the fabric of his coat. Sarah Gale. She was still out there, walking the streets of London, wearing a dead woman's jewelry. Proctor stepped off the curb, mud sucking at his boots. He turned east towards the Fleet. The night was young, and the dead did not wait for anyone. The door to the dead house stood slightly ajar, leaking a breath of air that smelled of vinegar and wet wool. Proctor pushed it open. The hinges complained, a high, thin shriek that scraped against the quiet of the yard. Inside, the gas jet burned low, casting a sickly yellow wash over the flagged floor. Mr. White stood by the table, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands stained pink from the basin. "You are later than I anticipated, Mr. Proctor." "The jail takes its time." Proctor removed his hat. He placed it on a shelf where the wood was dark with grease. "Show me." White nodded. He reached for the sheet covering the table. The linen was stiff, starched hard enough to stand on its own. He pulled it back. The remains lay arranged in anatomical order, though the color was wrong, gray and waxy like tallow left too long in the sun. Hannah Brown, or what the river and the butcher had left of her. Proctor stepped closer. His boots clicked on the stone. "The head was recovered from the canal mud 2 days past," White said. He pointed with a pair of forceps. "It matches the torso in complexion and dentition. There is no doubt this is the woman from Hackney." "And the cuts?" "Clean, precise." White picked up a segment of bone, the rib cage separated from the spine. "This was not done in anger. Anger is messy, anger hacks. This was done with patience." Proctor leaned in. The smell hit him then, cloying and sweet, the scent of meat kept too long in a larder. He did not flinch. He had seen enough death to know that recoiling served no purpose. He traced the line of a severance with his eye. The flesh had been peeled back, not torn. "A knife," Proctor said. "A very sharp one, likely a carving knife, or perhaps a butcher's steel kept to a razor edge." White set the bone down. It clattered against the table. "Look here, at the joint. The ligament was sliced through, not broken. The man knew where the body yields. He did not fight the bone." Greenacre, the grocer, a man who spent his days splitting joints of beef and mutton, who knew the resistance of cartilage better than the feel of a woman's skin. The thought turned in Proctor's stomach, heavy and sour. He straightened up. His back protested, a sharp twinge between the shoulder blades. "Can you swear to the tool?" "I can swear to the skill," White replied. He wiped his hands on a cloth that was already stained. An amateur would have shattered the sternum. This man navigated around it. He removed what he needed and discarded the rest with economy. It suggests a trade background, someone accustomed to preparing goods for sale. "Goods," Proctor tasted the word. It felt like ash. "She was a person, Mr. White, not a joint of meat." "In this room, Mr. Proctor, they are much the same. The law requires cause of death. The flesh provides the testimony now." White moved to the basin. He poured water from a pitcher. The stream splashed loudly in the small space. "There are bruises on the neck, consistent with strangulation, but the dismemberment occurred post-mortem. He killed her first, then he packed her." Proctor looked at the hands. They were pale, the nails broken. One finger was missing a ring. Greenacre's voice echoed from the corridor of Newgate, rattling in his memory. "She wears it still. The gold band with the pearls. A token of affection or a marker of ownership. If Gale wore the ring, she knew, or she had stolen it. Either way, it placed her in the shadow of the crime." "Will the surgeons testify to this?" Proctor asked. "We will, all three of us. The evidence is consistent across our examinations." White dried his hands. He turned to face Proctor. His expression was weary, the eyes sunk deep in shadows. "But be warned, Mr. Proctor. The defense will claim she died of natural causes. They will say the dismemberment was an act of panic by a grieving lover. They will try to make her death a tragedy of passion rather than a calculation of commerce." "Passion does not pack a trunk," Proctor said. "No, but lawyers will try to convince 12 men that it does." White folded the cloth. He covered the remains again. The shape beneath the linen was distinct, a human outline that refused to be ignored. "You need more than bone. You need witness. You need to place him at the scene with the knife in his hand." "I have the letters." Words on paper are easy to deny. A man can claim forgery. He can claim madness. White walked to the door. He held it open. The cold air from the yard rushed in, displacing the stagnation of the room. "Find someone who saw the blood. Find someone who heard the scream. The dead speak quietly, Mr. Proctor, the living shout." Proctor took his hat. He settled it on his head. The brim was damp from the fog outside. "I have a landlady. She saw them together. She saw the trunk." "Then press her. Fear makes witnesses forgetful. Remind her that forgetfulness looks like complicity in the eyes of a judge." Proctor stepped into the yard. The night air was sharper here, biting at his cheeks. He pulled his coat tighter. The image of the reconstructed body lingered behind his eyes, superimposed over the cobbles of the street. Hannah Brown, pieced together like a broken doll, waiting for justice that might not come. Greenacre sat in a cell, smiling. Gale walked free, wearing gold. "I will press her," Proctor said. He looked at White. "Keep them safe, the evidence." "It is safe enough. The dead do not run." Proctor turned away. He walked towards the gate. The iron bars were cold under his palm as he pushed them open. The street beyond was empty, save for a stray dog picking at a bone near the gutter. The fog had lowered, pressing down on the rooftops, swallowing the chimneys. He needed the landlady. Mrs. Gale? No, the landlady from Hackney. Mrs. Wilson. She had seen the trunk arrive. She had smelled the odor leaking from the wood. If she faltered, the case would crumble. Greenacre would walk. The knife would remain just a tool. Proctor stepped onto the pavement. His boots struck the stone with a rhythm that matched his pulse. He had to move. The night was wasting, and the witnesses were sleeping. He turned north towards the Hackney Road. The fog parted for him, then closed behind, sealing him in. The Hackney Road held the damp like a sponge, squeezing mist into the wool of Proctor's coat until he carried the weight of the clouds on his shoulders. Mrs. Wilson's lodging house stood 3 doors down from the Chandlers', a narrow brick throat that swallowed light and exhaled the smell of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. He did not knock. He pushed the latch, the wood warped enough to yield without protest, and stepped into a hallway where the gas jets sputtered, casting long, trembling shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Mrs. Wilson sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug that steamed in the chill air. She looked up, the color draining from a face already pale as curdled milk. "I told you all I know," she said, her voice cracked, a dry twig snapping underfoot. "I told the magistrate." Proctor closed the door. The latch clicked, a sound of finality that made her flinch. He did not remove his hat. Water dripped from the brim onto the flagstones, pooling near her bare feet. "The magistrate hears many things, Mrs. Wilson. He does not weigh them until they sit in the Old Bailey." Proctor moved closer, the floorboards groaning under his boots. "You said you smelled it, the odor from the trunk." "It was bad, like meat left in the sun." She pulled her shawl tighter, her knuckles white against the grey wool. "I told you, I thought it was offal from the butcher's." "You thought it was offal," Proctor repeated. He let the words hang, heavy and useless, before stripping them away. "But you saw Mr. Greenacre carry it. You saw him struggle with the weight. A joint of beef does not require 2 men to lift it, nor does it bleed through the wood when the weather turns warm." She looked away, her eyes fixed on the dying embers in the grate. The fire offered no warmth, only a faint, reddish glow that failed to reach the corners of the room. "He paid me extra for the trouble, said it was gifts for his wife. Fine silks, he said. That's what he told me." "And you believed him?" "I wanted to." She turned back, her gaze sharp with a sudden, desperate anger. "You think I'm a fool? Maybe I am. But a woman alone in this city learns to take the coin and ask no questions. If I'd known, if I'd guessed." "If you had guessed, you would have run to Bow Street 3 weeks ago." Proctor leaned against the mantelpiece, the heat searing his thigh through the wet wool. "Instead, you waited. Now the girl is in pieces in a surgeon's cellar, and you are the only one who can say he brought her there." "I can't go to court." The words tumbled out, fast and panicked. "He has friends, men who watch the street. If I say what I saw, they'll come for me. They'll burn the house down with me inside." "Greenacre is in Newgate. He sits in a cell 6 feet by 4 with iron bars between him and the world." Proctor kept his voice low, a steady rumble meant to anchor her fear. "His friends cannot help him now. The law has him. But the law is a sieve, Mrs. Wilson. It lets the truth slip through if the holes are too wide. Your testimony plugs the holes." She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. "You don't know them. You don't know what they do to women who talk." "I know what happens to women who stay silent." Proctor pushed off the mantle. He towered over her, blocking the faint light from the window. "Hannah Brown is dead, cut up and scattered like rubbish. Sarah Gale walks free, wearing a ring that belonged to the dead girl, and you sit here, warming your hands, pretending you didn't see the blood leak onto the stairs." "It wasn't blood," she whispered. "It was grease, I swear it, just grease." "Grease does not attract the flies," Proctor said. "Grease does not make a neighbor gag in the hallway. You told the constable about the flies. I read the deposition myself." She recoiled, pressing her back against the chair as if trying to merge with the wood. The lie had been thin, easily pierced, and now she had nowhere left to hide. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, fogging in the cold air. "What do you want from me?" she begged. "I'm just a landlady. I rent rooms. I don't kill people." "I want you to remember," Proctor said, "exactly what you saw, the date, the time, the color of his coat. Did he have a knife in his pocket? Did he speak to anyone on the street? Every detail matters, Mrs. Wilson. The defense counsel will pick at your story like a vulture at a carcass. If you hesitate, if you stumble, they will tear you apart. They will call you a liar, a drunk, a woman of loose morals who invents stories for attention." "I'm not a liar," she sobbed. A tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. "I'm scared." "Good." Proctor reached into his coat. He pulled out a notebook, the leather worn smooth by his thumb. "Fear keeps you sharp. Fear makes you remember, but do not let it make you silent." He opened the book to a fresh page. The paper was crisp, white against the gloom of the room. "Start again. from the moment he arrived at the door. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing the tears. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her along with the hope of ignorance. It was Tuesday, the 10th. No, the 11th. It was raining. Date first, Proctor corrected, then the rain. The 11th of February, she said, her voice trembling but clearer now. He came just after dusk. He had a cart, no, not a cart. He carried it himself, a large trunk covered in oilcloth. He was sweating despite the cold. His face was red and his hands were stained. Stained with what? Black like ink or dirt. She paused, her eyes widening as the memory sharpened. No, not dirt. It was under his nails, dark and crusty. He tried to wash them in the scullery before he went up, but the water was frozen in the pipe. He cursed. He cursed loud enough for the whole house to hear. Proctor wrote quickly, the scratch of the nib loud in the quiet room. What did he say? He said, damn this weather, damn the whole bloody lot. Then he dragged the trunk up the stairs. It scraped the wall, left a mark, a long dark smear on the plaster. She pointed towards the ceiling as if she could see the mark through the floorboards above. I went up later to check. The smell was terrible, sweet and rotting, like flowers left too long in a vase, and there were flies, even in February. They were buzzing around the keyhole. Proctor stopped writing. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the terror etched into the lines around her mouth. This was it, the smear on the wall, the flies in winter, the stains under the nails. It was not just suspicion anymore. It was the architecture of a crime. Did you see Miss Gale? He asked. She was there in the room when he brought it up. Mrs. Wilson's voice dropped to a whisper. She opened the door for him. She didn't look surprised. She just stepped aside and let him in. Then she locked the door. I heard the bolt slide, click, like a coffin closing. Proctor closed the notebook. The sound echoed the bolt in her memory. He tucked the book away, feeling the weight of it against his ribs. You will say this in court, he said. Every word, the flies, the stain, the bolt. They'll kill me, she whispered. If you do not speak, Greenacre walks, and if he walks, he knows where you live. Proctor turned towards the door. He needed to leave before her resolve crumbled again, before the fear swallowed her whole. I will assign a constable to watch the street, not for you, for the evidence. But know this, Mrs. Wilson, the only thing keeping you safe is the truth. Lies get you killed. Truth puts a man on the gallows. He opened the door. The fog rushed in, colder than before, filling the room with a grey, suffocating embrace. He stepped out onto the landing, leaving her alone with the fire and the ghosts of the 11th of February. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended. Outside, the street was empty, the cobbles slick with a fresh layer of mist. He pulled his collar up, shielding his neck from the damp. The notebook in his pocket felt hot, a coal against his side. He had the smell, the stain, the bolt. He had the living shouting. Now he needed the pawnbroker, the man who had taken the ring. If Gale had sold it, there would be a record, a name, a date, a description, a chain of copper links connecting the survivor to the dead. Proctor set off down the road, his boots striking the pavement with a rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock in his head. Time was running out. The trial was days away, and the defense was already sharpening their knives. He turned the corner, heading towards the city, where the gas lamps burned brighter and the ledgers never lied. The fog swirled around his legs, trying to hold him back, but he pushed through, a dark shape moving towards the light. The notebook burned against his ribs, a hard square of truth tucked inside the wool lining of his coat. Proctor kept his head down, ignoring the slick sheen of mud that coated the pavement like black ice. Fog curled around his ankles, thick and yellow, tasting of coal smoke and the river's decay. He walked without hurry, though his legs urged him to run, for a runner who ran looked desperate, and desperation smelled of weakness to the men who kept ledgers in the dark. Holborn lay ahead, a canyon of brick and shadow where the shops stayed open late to catch the trade of those who preferred no questions asked. The gas jets above the door sputtered in the damp, casting a sickly pallor over the faces of the few souls abroad at this hour. A cart rumbled past, wheels groaning under the weight of barrels, the driver invisible beneath a stack of sacks. Proctor stepped into the gutter to avoid the spray, his boot finding purchase on the stone sets beneath the muck. He needed the name. The ring was the linchpin, the metal circle that bound the widow Gale to the dead girl Brown. Without it, Sarah Gale remained a witness, With it, she became an accessory. He stopped before a shop front squeezed between a chandler and a cobbler. 3 brass balls hung above the door, tarnished to the color of old bile. No name was painted on the glass, only the universal sign of the pledge, understood by every thief and pauper from Whitechapel to Westminster. Proctor pushed the door open. A bell chimed, sharp and brittle, cutting through the stale air inside. The smell hit him first. Old velvet, moth-eaten wool, and the metallic tang of brass polish struggling against rust. A man stood behind a high counter, his face obscured by the green shade of a candle lamp. He did not look up when Proctor entered, his quills scratching against paper with the rhythm of a ticking clock. "Closed," the man said. The word dropped like a stone. Proctor removed his hat, revealing the grey frost of his sideburns. He placed both hands on the counter, leaning forward until the candlelight caught the scars on his knuckles. "The Bow Street office does not keep hours, Emrah." Sealer's Vane. The pawnbroker finally lifted his head. His eyes were small, wet, and darted towards the shadowed corners of the shop, as if expecting bailiffs to emerge from the piles of coats. "I have no custom for the runners tonight. Take your custom elsewhere." "I am not here to pledge." Proctor kept his voice level, stripping it of threat until it sounded like a statement of fact. "I am here to read the book, February the 10th to the 12th. Vane stiffened. The quill stopped scratching. He set it down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the ledger so that the tip pointed precisely north. "Privacy is the law of the trade, officer. You know this. A man's pledges are his own business unless he is declared felon." "A woman is dead," Proctor said, "dismembered, scattered across the parishes like offal." He let the image hang in the dusty air between them. "And a ring was sold, a gold band with a setting of paste stones. It belonged to the dead woman. The woman who sold it is in custody for aiding the murderer." Vane swallowed. The movement of his throat was visible in the dim light, a pale ripple against the collar of his shirt. He reached under the counter, his hand trembling slightly, and produced a large folio bound in cracked leather. The book thudded onto the wood, raising a small cloud of dust that danced in the candle flame. "February," Vane muttered. He turned the pages, the paper brittle and yellowed. "There are many entries. I cannot recall every face." "I do not need the face. I need the hand that wrote the name." Proctor watched the man's fingers. They were stained with ink, the nails ragged. "Look for Gale, Sarah Gale, of Camden Town." Vane's finger traced the lines of text. He paused. The silence stretched, tight as a wire. Outside, a carriage wheel clattered over the stones, the sound fading into the fog. Inside, the only motion was the flicker of the lamp and the slow rise of Vane's chest. Here, Vane turned the book around. The ink was still dark, the loops of the handwriting hurried. "Sarah Gale, 1 gold ring, 4 shillings. The date was written clearly beside it, 11th February. Proctor did not touch the book. He memorized the line, burning it into his mind, alongside Mrs. Wilson's testimony about the trunk. The dates aligned. The movement of the ring matched the movement of the body. Greenacre killed her on the 10th. Gale pawned the proof on the 11th. The machinery of the crime ground forward, precise and cruel. "Who took the ring?" Proctor asked. "A customer, male, tall." Vane looked away, focusing on a stack of plated spoons on the shelf behind him. He wore a coat of dark broadcloth, no hat. "I did not ask his name. The law does not require it for the purchaser, only the pledger." "Did he look like a grocer?" Vane shrugged, a jerky movement of his narrow shoulders. "He looked like a man with money. His hands were clean. That is all I recall." He began to close the ledger, his fingers pressing flat against the cover. "I have shown you what you asked. Now you must go. The watch will be making rounds soon, and I do not want trouble with the parish." Proctor straightened. His left shoulder gave a dull throb, the old injury reacting to the chill that seeped through the floorboards. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pencil, copying the entry onto a scrap of paper from his pocket. The scratch of graphite sounded loud in the quiet shop. "You will keep this book secure," Proctor said. He tucked the scrap away. "If a page goes missing, if a drop of water stains the ink, I will hold you responsible for the obstruction of a capital case. Do you understand me, Mr. Vane?" "I understand." Vane's voice was thin, stripped of its earlier defiance. He looked small behind the counter, swallowed by the shadows of his own trade. It stays where it is, under the lock. See that it does. Proctor pulled his hat back on, settling the brim low over his eyes. He turned to the door, the bell chiming again as he pushed it open. The fog rushed to meet him, colder now, biting at the exposed skin of his face. He stepped onto the pavement, the notebook heavy against his chest. The ledger entry was not the ring itself, but it was the chain that bound them. Greenacre could lie about the trunk. He could lie about the smell. He could not lie about the gold that had changed hands while Hannah Brown lay cold in the earth. Proctor walked towards the river, the sound of his boots echoing in the empty street. The magistrate would need to see this before morning. The warrant for Gale's committal needed to be ironclad, for the defense would tear at any loose thread until the whole tapestry unraveled. A dog barked in the distance, the sound muffled by the mist. Proctor did not look back. The shop behind him was sealed, the pawnbroker locking away the truth until the court called for it. Ahead, the city waited, vast and indifferent, hiding its sins in the folds of the night. He touched the pocket where the scrap of paper lay, feeling the edge of it through the wool. Evidence, just words on a page, yet heavier than the truncheon at his hip. He quickened his pace, the rhythm of his walk shifting from a patrol to a pursuit. The night was half gone, and the Old Bailey did not wait for tired men. The scrap of paper burned against his ribs, a sharp edge pressing through the wool of his waistcoat with every stride. Marlborough Street lay ahead, the buildings rising like dark teeth against the sulphurous sky, their windows shuttered tight against the night. Proctor halted before a townhouse of red brick, the mortar white and stark in the gloom, and lifted the iron knocker. It felt freezing under his glove, the metal biting into his palm as he let it fall. The clang echoed down the street, a harsh violation of the quiet, and he waited while the sound decayed into the fog. No movement came from within. He knocked again, harder this time, the rhythm urgent enough to wake the dead. Inside, a shuffle of footsteps approached, slow and reluctant, followed by the scraping of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened a fraction, a chain still holding it fast, revealing the eye of a servant framed in the gap. "Who demands entry at this hour?" The man's voice was thick with sleep, rough as gravel. "Proctor, Bow Street." He held his badge up to the slit, the metal catching the faint glow of the hall lantern behind the servant. "I require Mr. Henry's signature. It cannot wait for sunrise." The eye narrowed, then vanished. The chain rattled, the bolt slid back fully, and the door swung wide to admit the chill from the street. Proctor stepped across the threshold, leaving the fog outside to swirl around the doorframe like a living thing. The hall smelled of beeswax and stale tobacco, a domestic scent that clashed with the blood on his mind. He removed his hat, holding it against his thigh, and waited while the servant vanished into the depths of the house. Minutes stretched. Proctor shifted his weight, his left shoulder complaining with a dull ache that radiated down his arm. He thought of Hannah Brown, her head wrapped in lavender-scented linen, and the way her eyes had been closed forever before the sun rose on the Edgware Road. Justice was a slow machine, grinding its gears in the dark while the bodies cooled. He touched his pocket again, ensuring the scrap of paper remained secure. A door opened upstairs. Mr. Henry appeared on the landing, dressed in a dressing gown of heavy brocade, his hair uncombed and grey in the dim light. He descended slowly, gripping the banister with a hand that looked frail against the polished wood. Reaching the floor, he turned to Proctor, his expression one of weary irritation. "You bring me news that could not keep until the court sits." Henry's voice was soft, lacking the bite of the bench, yet it carried the weight of authority. "The committal for Greenacre," Proctor said, "and the woman, Gale. I have new evidence regarding the ring. It places them both at the scene of the disposal within hours of the death." Henry sighed, a sound of exhalation that fogged briefly in the unheated hall. He gestured towards the study, a room lined with books that smelled of leather and dust. Proctor followed, his boots sinking into the carpet, silencing his steps. Inside, a single candle burned on the desk, its flame trembling in the draught from the chimney. "Show me." Henry seated himself behind the desk, the wood creaking under his weight. Proctor produced the scrap of paper, smoothing it flat against the mahogany surface. The graphite mark stood out dark and clear, the copied lines from Vane's ledger. Henry leaned forward, squinting through the gloom, his fingers tracing the date written in the corner. February the 11th, Henry murmured, the day after the murder was committed. The same day the trunk was moved, Proctor added. She pawned the victim's ring to fund their flight. It binds her to the act, sir. She is no innocent bystander. Henry looked up, his eyes meeting Proctor's across the candle flame. There was a hesitation there, a flicker of doubt that haunted every magistrate when faced with the finality of a capital charge against a woman. He dipped a quill into the inkwell, the nib scratching against the pot as he sought the right amount of fluid. If the defense claims duress, Henry said, the quill hovering above the warrant. If she says he forced her hand. Then let them prove it, Proctor replied. But the law requires she answer for the possession. The rest is for the Old Bailey to decide. Henry nodded once and set the quill to the paper. The scratch of the nib was loud in the silence, ink flowing onto the fiber to seal the fate of two souls. He blew on the wet ink, watching it dry, then pushed the document across the desk. Proctor took it, folding it carefully to fit inside his coat, next to the scrap from the pawnbroker. See it done properly, Thomas, Henry said, leaning back in the chair, the energy draining from him now the duty was discharged. No errors. The press will watch this like hawks. There will be no errors. Proctor backed away from the desk, bowing his head slightly. Good night, sir. He left the study, the servant holding the door open with a face like stone. The street outside had not changed, the fog still clinging to the ground, but the weight in his pocket had shifted. The warrant was law now, a tangible thing that could lock a cell door. Proctor pulled his hat down, shielding his eyes from the wind, and turned his face towards Newgate. The prison loomed in the distance, a black mass against the grey dawn that was beginning to bleed into the sky. He walked without hurry, the rhythm of his boots steady on the stones. Inside those walls, Greenacre waited, perhaps sleeping, perhaps plotting lies for the morning court. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a cold resolve. The game was narrowing, the moves fewer, the stakes higher than mere liberty. A cart rumbled past, the driver hunched against the cold, the wheels groaning under the load of early market goods. Proctor stepped aside, pressing himself against the wall of a closed shop, the rough brick scraping his shoulder. He watched the cart pass, the horse breathing steam into the air, and then continued on his path. The city was waking, unaware of the justice being forged in its shadows. At the prison gates, the sentry challenged him, a musket held across the chest, the bayonet gleaming dull in the pre-dawn light. Proctor showed the warrant, the paper crisp and official in his hand. The sentry lowered the weapon, nodding, and signaled to the turnkey within the lodge. The heavy gates groaned open, revealing the yard beyond, paved with stones worn smooth by the feet of countless prisoners. Proctor stepped inside, the air shifting instantly to the smell of damp straw and unwashed bodies. He did not look towards the cells yet. He stood in the yard, feeling the enclosure close around him, the high walls blocking out the sky. The warrant was safe in his coat. The evidence was lodged. Now he needed to watch the prisoner face the morning. The turnkey approached, a lantern swinging in his hand, the light casting long, dancing shadows against the stone. "You wish to see the grocer?" the man asked, his voice echoing in the confined space. "I do," Proctor said, "before the sun rises fully." "He's awake, pacing his cell like a caged cat." The turnkey grinned, a flash of yellow teeth in the gloom. "Come then, let us see if he knows what comes." Proctor followed the lantern, the light bobbing ahead, leading him deeper into the heart of the stone beast. The corridor narrowed, the ceiling lowering, until the air felt thick enough to choke on. At the end of the passage, a single door stood ajar, a sliver of candlelight escaping onto the flags. Proctor stopped before it, his hand resting on the truncheon at his hip, and listened to the sound of footsteps pacing within. The turnkey shoved the iron latch, the metal screeching against the staple before the door swung inward on hinges thick with rust and tallow. Greenacre stood by the narrow cot, his hands clasped behind the small of his back, wearing a waistcoat of dark wool that had been brushed free of lint despite the grime of the confinement. He did not startle at the intrusion, nor did he step forward to greet the law, but merely tilted his head as one might acknowledge a tradesman arriving with a delayed order. Proctor crossed the threshold, the stone floor biting through the soles of his boots, while the turnkey remained in the corridor, the lantern light spilling across the prisoner's boots, which had been polished to a dull shine. "Mr. Greenacre," Proctor said, the words landing flat in the damp space. "Runner Proctor." The grocer's voice held a smoothness that belied the surroundings, lacking the rasp of fear one might expect from a man charged with murder. "I trust the magistrate found my previous statement satisfactory." The magistrate found cause. Proctor drew the warrant from his coat, the paper stiff from the cold, and held it out without stepping closer than necessary. "You are committed for trial at the Old Bailey. The charge remains murder." Greenacre accepted the document, his fingers pale and clean against the dark ink, and scanned the text with a speed that suggested he had already memorized the likely wording. He folded the paper along the original creases, precise and deliberate, before placing it upon the small wooden table that stood bolted to the wall. A Bible lay next to it, closed, the leather binding cracked from use, or perhaps from the humidity that seeped through the masonry. Outside, a bell began to toll within the prison yard, the sound muffled by the thickness of the walls, marking the hour when the gates would open for the day's business. "Murder is a strong word," Greenacre said, turning back to face the runner, his expression one of mild disappointment rather than terror. "I prefer to view it as a dispute over property that escalated beyond my control." She was a person, not a ledger entry. Proctor kept his hands visible, resting them on the truncheon at his hip, though he had no intention of drawing it within these stone confines. "Hannah Brown, do you deny knowing her?" "I deny nothing regarding acquaintance." Greenacre moved to the table, pouring water from a pitcher into a tin cup, the liquid glugging loudly in the small room. "But knowledge is not culpability, and you know the law as well as I. Circumstance requires proof, not merely the suspicions of a Bow Street officer with a grudge against commerce." Proctor watched the man drink, noting the steady hand that lifted the cup, the lack of tremor in the wrist that would betray a conscience waking in the night. There was no sweat on the brow, no shifting of weight from foot to foot, only the calm calculation of a merchant assessing a loss he intended to recoup elsewhere. It struck Proctor then, with the dull weight of a stone in the gut, that Greenacre truly believed he might walk free, that the scattering of flesh across parishes had been a strategy sound enough to baffle the courts. The arrogance sat on him like a well-tailored coat, hiding the rot beneath. "The proof will be heard in April," Proctor said. "Until then, you remain here." "April is some distance off." Greenacre set the cup down, the tin ringing against the wood. "I shall require writing materials. My business cannot suffer simply because the law moves at a crawl." "You shall have what the governor allows." Proctor stepped back, the air in the cell feeling heavier now, pressed down by the presence of a man who viewed death as a transactional error. "Do not expect comfort. You are charged with a capital offense." "And yet I breathe." Greenacre smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach the eyes. "That suggests the law is not as swift as you claim, Mr. Proctor. Time favors the prepared mind." Proctor turned away, the urge to strike the man rising in his shoulders like a heat he had to suppress with sheer discipline. He walked to the door, the turnkey stepping aside to let him pass, the lantern light swinging back towards the corridor as the iron latch was drawn shut once more. The lock clicked, a final sound that echoed down the passage, separating the living from the condemned even before the judge had spoken the sentence. Proctor did not look back at the slit in the door where the prisoner would now be watching, measuring the runner's retreat for signs of weakness. The walk back through the yard felt longer than the arrival, the grey dawn having strengthened into a pale light that revealed the soot streaking the walls of the exercise ground. Men leaned against the railings of the upper galleries, faces shadowed by the overhang, watching the officer pass with the dull curiosity of those who have nothing else to measure the day by. Proctor kept his gaze forward, focusing on the gate where the sentry stood, the musket now resting against the shoulder, the bayonet no longer gleaming but dull in the morning haze. He showed the warrant again, the paper damp from the cell air, and the sentry waved him through without a word, the heavy timber swinging open to admit the street beyond. London waited outside, the noise of carts and cries of vendors rising to meet him, indifferent to the justice secured within the stone walls behind. He pulled his hat down, shielding his eyes from the wind that carried the smell of coal smoke and river mud from the direction of the fleet. The warrant was served, the prisoner committed, yet the work remained unfinished, hanging over him like the fog that refused to burn off despite the rising sun. Greenacre would sit in his cell and plot, weaving lies for the jury, while the fragments of Hannah Brown lay in the morgue, waiting for someone to speak for them. Proctor turned left onto Newgate Street, the cobblestones slick with overnight frost, his thoughts drifting to the woman currently held in the Horsemonger Lane jail. Sarah Gale. She had pawned the ring, possessed the clothes, yet claimed fear of the grocer's hand. The law would demand she answer for it, just as Henry had said, but Proctor knew the difference between a killer and a survivor trapped in the same cage. He touched the pocket where the warrant had been, feeling the empty space where the paper now rested in the court files, and wondered if justice could truly distinguish between the shark and the fish swimming in its wake. A hansom cab rattled past, the driver urging the horse through the muck, the wheels spraying dirty water onto the pavement where Proctor walked. He stepped onto the curb, avoiding the splash, and continued towards the stand where a coach might be hired for the journey south. The city was fully awake now, the shops opening their shutters, the everyday commerce of life resuming despite the murder charge lodged in the heart of it. He needed to speak to Gale before the defense counsel could whisper promises of acquittal into her ear, needed to see if her fear was genuine or merely a mask painted for the magistrate. The morning stretched ahead, long and grey, demanding more than just the serving of papers. He flagged down a passing hackney, the driver pulling the horse to a halt with a jerk of the reins that sent steam billowing from the animal's nostrils. Proctor gave the destination, climbing into the cab where the leather seats were cracked and cold, smelling of old tobacco and rain. As the vehicle lurched forward, joining the flow of traffic towards the bridge, he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the wheels on the stones dull the edge of his weariness. The trial was months away, but the battle for the truth began now, in the spaces between the warrants and the cells, where the living still had voices to lose. The hackney lurched over the uneven sets of Blackfriars Bridge, the motion jarring Proctor's left shoulder until the old ache bloomed into a sharp, familiar fire that demanded his attention. He shifted his weight, pressing his back against the cracked leather squab, and watched through the grimy window as the river below slid past, a thick, oily ribbon of brown water that seemed to swallow the reflections of the warehouses lining its banks. The driver shouted something to a cart blocking the way, his voice cracking through the thin wood of the cab roof, but Proctor did not hear the words, only the strain in the man's throat. Southwark awaited them, a district of narrow streets and tangled alleys where the air always tasted of tallow and damp brick, and where Sarah Gale sat in a cell wondering if the noose was being measured for her neck. Proctor reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing the empty space where the warrant for Greenacre had rested only an hour before, and found instead the folded note detailing Gale's last known statement to the turnkey. She claimed she had acted under duress, terrified of the grocer's temper, yet the ring of Hannah Brown had been found in her possession, pawned for silver to buy silence or perhaps just bread. The cab slowed as it approached the junction, the horse snorting steam into the cold air, and Proctor felt the sudden, urgent need to see the woman's face without the mask of the courtroom between them. He wanted to know if her eyes held the guilt of a conspirator or the hollow stare of a victim who had survived by becoming complicit. The driver pulled up outside the jail, the wheels crunching on the frost-hardened mud of the yard, and Proctor stepped down onto the pavement, his boots striking the ground with a solid thud that anchored him against the swirling fog. A warder met him at the gate, a man with a face like cured leather and eyes that had seen too many prisoners walk to the drop to retain any spark of surprise. "Here for the Gale woman, sir," the warder asked, his voice flat, devoid of curiosity or judgment. "Yes," Proctor replied, handing over the authorization from Marlborough Street. "She is expecting me." "Expecting or not, she's in the same state as yesterday," the warder said, unlocking the heavy iron gate with a clatter of keys that sounded like bones rattling in a sack. "Sitting on her bunk, staring at the wall, doesn't speak unless spoken to, and even then it's mostly whispers." Proctor followed him through the courtyard, the high walls blocking out the morning sun and casting the ground in a perpetual grey twilight that smelled of urine and unwashed wool. They passed a group of women exercising in the yard, their heads bowed, their shawls pulled tight against the chill, none of them looking up as the officer passed. The warder led him to a door at the far end of the block, pausing to unlock it with a deliberate slowness that suggested he enjoyed the small power he held over the moments of others. "Mind your step," the warder muttered, pushing the door open to reveal a narrow corridor lined with cells, the air inside stagnant and heavy with the scent of mildew. "She's at the end. Don't stay too long. The governor likes the cells empty before the bell rings for dinner." Proctor nodded, walking down the corridor alone, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly against the stone walls until he reached the cell marked with a chalk number. He stopped before the small grille in the door, peering into the dim interior, where a figure sat hunched on the edge of a wooden bunk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Gale," Proctor said, his voice low, careful not to startle her. The woman looked up, her face pale and drawn, the shadows under her eyes deep enough to suggest she had not slept since her arrest. "Mr. Proctor," she whispered, her voice cracking on the second syllable, "have you come to tell me it is done? Is he locked away?" "Greenacre is in Newgate," Proctor answered, stepping closer to the bars so she could see his face clearly. "He is secured, but that does not mean your part in this is finished, Sarah." She flinched at the use of her Christian name, her shoulders tightening as if bracing for a blow. "I told you everything," she said, her eyes darting to the corner of the cell where a small pile of straw lay scattered on the floor. "I told you I was afraid. He would have killed me too if I hadn't done as he said. You must believe me." "Fear is a powerful excuse," Proctor said, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. "But it does not explain why you pawned the ring. It does not explain why you helped him wrap the parcel. Those are actions, Sarah, not reactions." "I didn't know what was in the parcel," she cried, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that echoed down the corridor. "He told me it was meat, offal from the shop. I only found out later when I saw the blood soaking through the paper. By then, it was too late to stop him." Proctor watched her closely, searching for the tremor of a lie in her hands or the shift of her gaze that might betray her. She looked small in the dim light, her dress hanging loosely on her frame, her hair pulled back in a severe knot that emphasized the sharp angles of her cheeks. "And the ring?" Proctor asked, his tone unchanged. "Did he force you to pawn that too? Did he hold a knife to your throat while you walked into the broker's shop?" Sarah Gale looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the hem of her skirt until the fabric bunched into a tight white knot. "He needed the money," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "He said we needed to leave London, to go somewhere where no one knew us. I thought if I helped him, he would let me go. I thought I could buy my life back." Proctor felt a cold knot form in his stomach, not of disgust, but of a weary recognition of the terrible bargains people made when trapped between a monster and the wall. He had seen it before, in the rookeries of St. Giles and the dens of Wapping, where survival often meant staining one's own soul to keep breathing for another day. "You cannot buy life back with stolen goods, Sarah," Proctor said, his voice gentle now, stripped of the accusation. "And you cannot wash the blood off your hands by claiming you didn't see it until it was too late. The court will hear your story, but they will also see the evidence. They will see the ring, the clothes, the letters." "Will they hang me?" she asked, looking up at him with eyes that were wide and wet with unshed tears. "Tell me the truth, Mr. Proctor. Will they hang me like him?" Proctor hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him heavier than the damp fog outside. He could not promise her safety, for the law was a blunt instrument that rarely distinguished between the hand that struck and the hand that held the lantern. "I do not know," he admitted, the honesty tasting bitter in his mouth. "That is for the jury to decide, but if you wish to have any chance, you must tell me everything. Every word he spoke, every place he took you, every lie he told. No more secrets, Sarah, not now." She nodded slowly, a single tear tracking down her cheek to disappear into the collar of her dress. "There is a letter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He wrote it before we left the lodging. He hid it in the lining of his coat, the one he wore on the night she died. I saw him put it there. I didn't take it, but I know where it is." Proctor straightened, his interest sharpening instantly, the weariness in his shoulders receding as the scent of a new clue cut through the stagnation of the cell. "Where is the coat now?" he asked, his voice crisp, urgent. "In the pawnbroker's," she replied, looking at him with a desperate hope. "He pawned it the next morning before the parcel was found. He said he needed the cash for the journey. It's still there, waiting to be claimed." Proctor turned away from the door, his mind already racing ahead to the shop, to the coat, to the hidden letter that might seal Greenacre's fate, or perhaps reveal a darkness even deeper than the one they had already uncovered. "Give me the name of the broker," Proctor said, turning back to face her. "And pray that the coat is still there, Sarah, because if it is gone, then so is your only chance." She recited the name and the street, her voice gaining strength with each word, as if the act of giving up the secret had lifted a burden she had been carrying for weeks. Proctor nodded, committing the details to memory, and signaled to the warder at the end of the corridor that he was finished. "Stay here," he instructed her, his tone final. "Do not speak to anyone else about this, not the other prisoners, not the guards, only me." He walked back down the corridor, the warder falling into step beside him, the keys jingling softly as they moved towards the light of the yard. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a patch of pale blue sky above the prison walls, but Proctor knew the air was still thick with the unspoken truths of the women locked inside. He stepped out into the yard, the cold wind hitting his face, and headed for the gate, his mind focused on the pawnbroker's shop and the coat that might hold the final piece of the puzzle. The trial was months away, but the hunt for the truth was far from over, and every minute counted. The iron gate groaned on its hinges, a sound like a dying animal dragged across stone, before swinging shut to sever Proctor from the yard. He did not look back. The warder's keys fell silent as the man retreated into the shadows of the block, leaving the runner alone with the wind that whipped across the prison courtyard, carrying the scent of wet lime and unwashed wool. Proctor pulled his collar up against the bite of the air, his fingers brushing the rough fabric where the damp had already begun to settle, heavy and clinging. Silas Vane waited by the outer archway, shifting his weight from one boot to the other, his breath puffing in white clouds that vanished almost as soon as they formed. The constable's face was red with cold, his nose running slightly, a testament to the hours spent standing guard while the interrogation unfolded inside. He straightened when he saw Proctor, snapping a hand to his forehead in a salute that lacked precision but held enough respect to pass. "Is it done, sir?" Vane asked, his voice cracking on the final word as the wind caught it. "For now," Proctor replied, stepping past him into the narrow lane that led towards the main road. "We have a direction. Whether it leads to justice or merely another dead end remains to be seen." They walked in silence for a stretch, the mud of the lane sucking at their boots with a wet, rhythmic slurp that seemed to echo the pounding of Proctor's own tired heart. The sky above was a bruised purple, threatening snow, but delivering only a biting chill that seeped through the soles of their shoes and settled in the marrow. Proctor thought of Sarah Gale's hands, twisting that hem until the fabric screamed, and the desperate hope in her eyes when she spoke of the coat. It was a fragile thing, hope, easily shattered by the weight of a pawnbroker's ledger or the greed of a man who cared nothing for the source of his profit. "The broker," Proctor said suddenly, breaking the quiet that had grown too comfortable. She gave a name. "Mr. Jacobs," Vane answered, scrambling to keep pace with the runner's long, purposeful strides. "On Gray's Inn Lane, near the turning for Holborn. She said he took the coat 2 days past." 2 days. Proctor spat the words onto the ground, watching the saliva freeze almost instantly on the frozen mud. In this city, 2 days is a lifetime. A coat can be stripped, sold, cut up for rags, or burned to ash in the time it takes to walk from here to the river. "Then we must hurry, sir." "Hurry will not help if the man has already fled," Proctor muttered, though he quickened his pace regardless, his left shoulder protesting the sudden increase in movement with a sharp, familiar twinge. "But we shall see. If Greenacre was foolish enough to leave a letter in the lining, he was foolish enough to believe the coat would never be searched. Men like him trust in their own cleverness until the noose tightens. The streets grew busier as they moved away from the prison, the flow of omnibuses and carts creating a cacophony of wheels on stone and shouted curses that filled the air with a thick, chaotic energy. A dray horse slipped on a patch of ice, its hooves scrabbling uselessly against the cobbles before the driver yanked the reins, shouting a stream of obscenities that drew laughter from a group of chimney sweeps huddled in a doorway. Proctor navigated the throng with the ease of a man who had spent decades moving through the veins of London, dodging a wheelbarrow laden with coal and stepping around a puddle of filthy water that reflected the grey sky like a broken mirror. He focused on the rhythm of the walk, the mechanical repetition of placing one foot in front of the other, allowing his mind to drift towards the possibilities awaiting them at the pawnshop. A letter, written by Greenacre's own hand. If it existed, it could be the nail in the coffin, the tangible proof that linked the grocer directly to the disposal of the remains, bypassing the need for Sarah Gale's testimony entirely. Yet doubt gnawed at him, a persistent rat in the walls of his certainty. Greenacre was a man of calculation, a trader who weighed every ounce and measured every inch. Would he truly leave such a damning artifact behind, hidden in a garment he intended to sell for a few shillings? Or was it a trap, a planted lie from Gale to buy time, to send the runner chasing ghosts, while the real evidence rotted in a fire grate somewhere in the East End? "Sir," Vane said, tugging at Proctor's sleeve as they approached a crossroads where the fog seemed to gather in thicker, more impenetrable swathes. "Gray's Inn Lane is ahead. The sign is just visible through the mist." Proctor stopped, wiping his spectacles with the handkerchief from his pocket, the linen already damp and smudged with soot. He polished the lenses with a frantic circular motion, squinting until the blurred shapes of the buildings resolved into distinct forms: the jagged roofline of a warehouse, the flickering gas lamp outside a public house, and the three golden balls hanging above a narrow shopfront further down the street. "There," he said, pointing with a gloved finger, "Jacobs." The shop was dark, the shutters half drawn against the early evening gloom, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. A single candle burned within, its light feeble and wavering, illuminating stacks of tools, bundles of clothing, and the chaotic clutter of a business that thrived on the misfortune of others. Proctor approached the door, rapping his knuckles against the wood with a sharp, authoritative rhythm that brooked no delay. No answer came immediately, only the sound of shuffling feet from within, followed by the soft clink of metal on wood. "Open up," Proctor called out, his voice low but carrying an edge of command that cut through the street noise. "Bow Street, we require entry." The lock turned with a heavy click, and the door creaked open to reveal a small, stooped man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, his face pale and drawn in the candlelight. He looked from Proctor to Vane, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the official stance of the constable and the grim determination etched into the runner's features. "Shop's closed," the man stammered, clutching the edge of the door as if it were a shield. "Come back tomorrow, gentlemen. I've no custom left for the day." "We are not here for custom, Mr. Jacobs," Proctor said, stepping forward until he filled the doorway, forcing the pawnbroker to retreat or be pushed aside. "We are here for a coat, a dark wool coat, pawned by a James Greenacre 2 days ago." The color drained from Jacob's face, leaving him looking like parchment stretched over bone. He glanced nervously over Proctor's shoulder towards the street, as if expecting a mob or a rescue that would not come. I cannot recall," Jacobs whispered, his voice trembling. "Many coats come through, many men. I do not keep track of every name." "You keep track of the pledges," Proctor countered, his gaze fixed on the man's shifting eyes. "And you keep track of the law. Obstructing a Bow Street runner in a capital investigation is a serious matter, Mr. Jacobs, one that could see you locked up alongside your customers before the night is out." He pushed past the man, entering the stifling warmth of the shop, which smelled of old cloth, mothballs, and the sharp tang of brass polish. Vane followed, closing the door against the cold, sealing them in the dim, cluttered space where secrets were bought and sold for pennies. "The ledger," Proctor said, turning to face the pawnbroker, who stood frozen behind the counter, his hands shaking visibly. "Bring it out, now, and pray that the coat is still on your rack, for if it is gone, you will have much more to answer for than a simple failure of memory." Jacobs swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat, before turning slowly towards the shelves behind him, his movements stiff with fear. The candle flame flickered violently as a draught slipped through the cracks in the shutters, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach out like grasping fingers, waiting to see what would be revealed in the light. Jacobs moved with the jerky hesitation of a puppet whose strings had tangled, his fingers scraping against the leather bindings of the ledgers stacked on the shelf behind him. Dust motes danced in the single candle's flare, swirling upward as if disturbed by a sudden breath, though the air in the shop remained stagnant and heavy with the scent of damp wool. He pulled a thick volume free, the cover cracked and stained with rings of spilled gin or perhaps grease, and laid it upon the counter with a thud that sounded too loud in the cramped silence. "January," Proctor said, leaning over the wood, his shadow stretching long across the ledger's pages to swallow the cramped handwriting before the pawnbroker could turn the leaf. "The 14th, or the 15th, do not make me find it myself." Jacobs flinched, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the book, and turned the pages with a wet thumb, the paper rustling like dry leaves underfoot. The smell of the shop pressed closer, a cloying mixture of camphor and the sour tang of unwashed bodies that seemed to cling to every garment hanging from the rafters. Proctor watched the man's eyes darting sideways, tracking the movement of the finger down the column of names, waiting for the telltale pause that would confirm the lie or seal the trap. "Here," Jacobs whispered, tapping a line near the bottom of the page where the ink was still slightly glossy. "Greenacre, James, of the Strand, a coat of dark wool lined with baize, pawned for 4 shillings. "And the coat?" Proctor asked, straightening up until his spine clicked, a sharp sound that made Vane shift his weight near the door. "Is it still here, Mr. Jacobs, or has it already found its way to a fence in Whitecapel?" The pawnbroker hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on the deck of a boat, before he gestured vaguely towards a rack of clothes hanging in the shadows at the rear of the shop. It should be there. I have not sold it. No one wants a coat so heavy in this weather, and the lining is torn." Proctor did not wait for an invitation. He stepped around the counter, brushing past Jacobs with a shoulder that felt stiff and unyielding, and moved towards the back of the shop, where the gloom was thickest. His boots sank into the pile of discarded rags on the floor, each step releasing a puff of stale air that tasted of rot and old sweat. Vane followed close behind, holding the candle aloft so that the light swung wildly, casting distorted shapes against the walls that seemed to writhe as they passed. There, hanging among a dozen other garments of varying quality and decay, was the coat. It was dark, almost black in the flickering light, with a collar that had been turned up to hide the wear on the fabric. Proctor reached out, his gloved hand grasping the lapel, and pulled it forward into the circle of illumination. The baize lining was indeed torn, a jagged rip near the pocket that looked less like wear and more like a hasty search. "Turn it out," Proctor commanded, his voice dropping to a murmur that carried more weight than a shout. "Check the pockets, every seam." Vane set the candle on a stack of boxes and began to probe the pockets with careful, deliberate movements, his fingers digging deep into the lining. Jacobs hovered near the counter, wringing his hands, his eyes fixed on the coat as if it were a venomous snake that might strike at any moment. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, broken only by the rustle of fabric and the occasional clink of a button against a metal tool on the shelf. "Nothing in the left," Vane said, his voice tight with concentration. "Right pocket is... wait." He paused, his fingers freezing inside the depth of the wool, and then slowly withdrew a folded piece of paper, crumpled and stained with what looked like oil or perhaps blood. The paper was small, barely large enough to hold a few lines of script, and it had been tucked so deeply into the seam that it would have been missed by any but the most thorough search. Proctor snatched it from Vane's hand, holding it close to the candle flame to decipher the handwriting. The script was neat, precise, the loops of the letters forming with a disciplined regularity that spoke of a man accustomed to keeping accounts. It was a note, addressed to no one in particular, yet containing instructions that chilled the blood more effectively than the winter draft slipping through the shutters. "Dispose of the remainder by the canal." The water takes all secrets eventually. Proctor felt a coldness spread through his chest, distinct from the damp chill of the shop, as the words settled into his mind with the finality of a judge's gavel. He looked up at Jacobs, whose face had gone ashen, the color draining away until he resembled a corpse freshly pulled from the Thames. "Did you read this?" Proctor asked, his tone devoid of anger, stripped bare to the raw bone of inquiry. "When you took the coat, did you see what was hidden inside?" "No, I swear it," Jacob stammered, backing away until his hips hit the counter, his hands raised in a futile gesture of defense. "I never look inside the pockets, sir. It is bad luck, bad for business. I just take the item and give the money." "Bad luck," Proctor repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And yet, you took a coat from a man who may well have murdered a woman to get rid of it. Your luck seems to be running rather thin, Mr. Jacobs." He folded the note carefully, placing it inside his own breast pocket next to his handkerchief, feeling the rough texture of the paper against his ribs like a second heart beating a frantic, irregular rhythm. This was it, the link, the tangible thread that connected the respectable grocer of the Strand to the grisly parcel found on the Edgware Road, bypassing the need for Sarah Gale's terrified testimony or the unreliable whispers of the rookeries. Greenacre had signed his own warrant with a few strokes of a pen, confident that the fog would swallow his words before they could be spoken aloud. "Vain," Proctor said, turning away from the pawnbroker, who was now trembling so violently that the counter shook beneath his weight. "Take Mr. Jacobs into custody. Charge him with obstructing justice and holding evidence in a capital case. We shall see if the magistrate at Marlborough Street finds his luck as favorable as he does." "But sir," Vane hesitated, glancing from the pale, terrified face of the pawnbroker to the grim set of Proctor's jaw. "He is just a fence. He did not cut her up." "He knew," Proctor said, his voice low and hard as granite. "Or he should have known. In this city, ignorance is a luxury no one can afford when blood is on the ledger." He moved towards the door, the coat still hanging limp in the shadows behind them, a silent witness to the transaction that had sealed a man's fate. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the glass of the shop window like a living thing eager to reclaim the street. Proctor pushed the door open, stepping out into the cold embrace of the evening, the note burning a hole in his pocket as he walked towards the waiting carriage that would carry them back to Bow Street. The wheels of the hansom crunched over the frozen mud of the lane, the sound sharp and brittle in the quiet air, as Proctor climbed inside and signaled the driver to make haste. He leaned back against the worn leather seat, closing his eyes for a moment to block out the swaying gas lamps and the endless procession of shadows that lined the route to the river. The note was in his possession, the coat was secured, and the net was finally closing around James Greenacre, yet there was no triumph in his heart, only a weary resignation to the grim machinery of the law that would now grind forward until a life was extinguished in the yard at Newgate. He opened his eyes as the carriage lurched around a corner, staring out at the blurred shapes of the buildings rushing past, wondering if Hannah Brown could feel the cold from wherever her scattered remains now rested beneath the ice of the Regent's Canal. The thought lingered, unbidden and unwelcome, a ghost in the carriage that no amount of brandy or bravado could exorcise. "Where to, sir?" the driver called down through the trap, his voice muffled by the wind and the clatter of hooves. "Bow Street," Proctor replied, the words automatic, devoid of hope or fear. "And then, perhaps, the river. We have a date to keep with the water." The carriage sped on, disappearing into the fog, leaving the pawnshop and its trembling occupant behind in the dark, while the note in Proctor's pocket seemed to pulse with a life of its own, ticking away the final hours of James Greenacre's freedom. The carriage wheel struck a pothole deep enough to jar the teeth, a sudden violence that threw Proctor against the splintered wood of the door frame until his bruised shoulder screamed in protest. He did not rub it. Pain was merely a reminder that the body remained intact, unlike the scattered geography of Hannah Brown. Outside, the fog had ceased to be a weather event and become a physical obstruction, a yellow-grey wool stuffed into the throat of the city so thick that the gas lamps along Holborn appeared as dying embers struggling for air. The driver whipped the horse, a sharp crack that sounded like a bone snapping, urging the beast forward through the mire, while the iron rims of the wheels ground against the frozen ruts of the road with a rhythmic, teeth-grating screech. Bow Street, the driver called again, his voice thin and frayed by the wind whipping through the trap. Or do you mean to ride until the horse drops, sir? Drive, Proctor shouted back, the word torn from him by the gusts. Unless you fancy walking the rest of the way with a warrant in your pocket. He settled back, the leather seat cold and damp beneath his coat, smelling of wet dog and the stale tobacco smoke of 1,000 previous passengers who had ridden the same route to give testimony or receive a sentence. The note in his breast pocket felt heavy, a lead weight pressing against his ribs, though it was nothing more than a scrap of paper with ink upon it. Ink that smelled of gall nuts and iron, the same ink used to write love letters, grocery lists, and death warrants. Greenacre had written it with a steady hand, likely sitting at a clean desk in a warm room, unaware that every loop of his G and cross of his T was weaving the rope that would soon tighten around his own neck. It was a peculiar arrogance, the belief that one's own handwriting could remain innocent while describing the disposal of a human being. The carriage lurched left, turning towards the Strand, and Proctor gripped the strap overhead, his knuckles white against the gloom. He thought of Jacobs, the pawnbroker, trembling behind his counter with the scent of fear souring the air around him. A small man, caught in a large machinery he did not understand, hoping that ignorance would serve as a shield against the gallows. It would not. The law did not care for the size of the man, only the weight of the evidence. Yet, as the buildings flashed past in blurred shadows of brick and mortar, Proctor felt no satisfaction in the arrest. There was only the grim necessity of it, the grinding of gears that could not be stopped once engaged. "Almost there, sir," the driver muttered, slowing the pace as the wheels hit the smoother paving stones near the office. "Fog's getting worse down by the river. Can't see 10 yards ahead." "Stop here," Proctor commanded, leaning forward to tap the roof with his cane. "Do not risk the horse's legs on the ice near the archway." The carriage halted with a final shudder, the horse blowing steam into the freezing air, its flanks heaving beneath the harness. Proctor pushed the door open and stepped down, his boots finding purchase on the slick pavement with a cautious tread that belied his urgency. The cold hit him instantly, biting through his wool coat, carrying with it the stench of the Thames rotting seaweed, coal dust, and the underlying sweetness of things that had died and not been found. He pulled his collar up, shielding his ears from the wind, and walked towards the iron gates of Bow Street, where a single lantern swung wildly in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows across the wet cobblestones. A constable stood guard by the entrance, his face red with cold, stamping his feet to keep the blood moving in his boots. He straightened as Proctor approached, snapping a salute that was more reflex than respect. "Runner Proctor," the man said, his breath pluming in the air. "Magistrate still inside, waiting on word from the Strand." "He can wait no longer," Proctor replied, brushing past him into the relative shelter of the hallway. "Bring Vane to the interrogation room, and send for a clerk who can write fast enough to keep up with the truth." "Sir," the constable nodded, turning to shout down the corridor, his voice echoing off the bare plaster walls. "Runners back, clear the room." Proctor moved through the familiar dimness of the station, the smell of old paper, ink, and unwashed bodies wrapping around him like a shroud. This place was a machine for processing sin, grinding down the desperate and the wicked until they were reduced to depositions and court dates. He reached the door of the small room designated for interviews, pausing with his hand on the latch. Inside, he could hear the scratch of a quill, the low murmur of voices, the shifting of chairs on the floorboards. Ordinary sounds. Domestic sounds. They belied the horror waiting in the ledger, the coat, and the note burning against his chest. He pushed the door open. The room was lit by a single candle that guttered in the draught from the chimney, casting flickering light onto the faces of the two men waiting for him. One was a clerk, young and eager, with ink-stained fingers and eyes wide, with the thrill of proximity to capital case. The other was Silas Vane, standing by the window with his arms crossed, looking out at the nothingness of the fog, as if expecting an answer to appear in the grey swirl. "You took your time," Vane said without turning, his voice rough with fatigue. "Jacobs is singing, or so I hear. Did he give you the whole song?" He gave me the verse I needed, Proctor said, closing the door against the noise of the station. He walked to the table and placed the folded note down with deliberate care, smoothing the creases with his thumb. And he gave me the coat. The rest is merely procedure. Procedure, Vane scoffed, turning finally to face him, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the note. Is that what we call it now? Binding a man for murder on the word of a frightened fence. Not just the word, Proctor corrected, his gaze locking onto Vane's. The handwriting, Greenacre's own hand, detailing the movement of the parcel. Jacobs confirmed the date, the time, and the description of the man who sold it. There is no ambiguity left, sealers. The fog has lifted enough for us to see the shape of it. And Sarah Gale? Vane asked, stepping closer to the table, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floorboards. Does this paper mention her, or does it leave her twisting in the wind while we hang the grocer? Proctor hesitated, his fingers hovering over the edge of the note. The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke from the candle. Gale was the loose thread, the woman who had held the coat, who had likely known the contents, who had survived by silence and quick lies. The note did not name her. It did not need to. The law would demand a scapegoat, or perhaps an accomplice, and the machinery was already gearing up to chew through her defense. The note mentions the coat, Proctor said slowly, choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon. It mentions the price paid. It mentions the urgency of the sale. What it does not say is often louder than what it does. Then we are still guessing, Vane muttered, leaning back against the wall, crossing his arms again. Guessing gets men hanged wrong, Thomas. You know that better than most. We are not guessing, Proctor snapped, the fatigue finally fraying his temper. We are following the trail of blood, however faint. If Gale is innocent, the facts will show it. If she is not, then the facts will show that too. My duty is to the truth, not to your comfort or hers. He picked up the note again, holding it up to the candlelight, so the ink glowed dark and sharp against the yellowed paper. The letters seemed to dance in the flame, the loops of Greenacre's signature looking like nooses waiting to be tightened. Get the clerk ready, Proctor ordered, his voice dropping back into that low, gravelly register that brooked no argument. We start the deposition now, before the fog swallows the rest of the night. Vane pushed himself off the wall, a reluctant movement that spoke of doubts he would not voice aloud. He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle, looking back at Proctor with an expression that was neither trust nor distrust, but a weary acknowledgement of the burden they both carried. Remember, Vane said softly, the river takes many secrets, but it gives few back. Make sure this one is worth the drowning. He opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, calling for the clerk to bring his ink and quill. Proctor remained alone in the room, the candle flickering as the draft from the open door disturbed the flame. He looked down at the note one last time, tracing the date written in the corner. January 1837, a new year, a new king, and the same old killing. He folded the paper and placed it back in his pocket, feeling the weight of it settle against his heart, a cold stone in a warm chest. Outside, the wind howled through the chimney, a mournful sound that echoed the cries of the dead who had no voice in the courtrooms of London. Proctor turned to the table, pulling a chair out with a scrape that sounded too loud in the sudden quiet, and waited for the clerk to arrive. The machinery was turning. There was no stopping it now. The scrape of the chair leg against the floorboards died away, leaving a silence that felt less like peace and more like the holding of breath before a plunge into freezing water. Proctor stood alone, the single candle guttering as the draft from the corridor snatched at the flame, casting his shadow long and distorted against the peeling plaster of the wall. He did not sit. To sit was to admit a pause, and the momentum of the case felt too fragile, too prone to shattering if he allowed himself the luxury of rest. The note in his pocket pressed against his thigh, a hard square of paper that seemed to radiate a coldness distinct from the winter chill seeping through the brickwork. Footsteps approached in the hall, heavier than Vane's, dragging slightly as if the man carrying them wore boots filled with lead. The door opened again, admitting a gust of stale air that smelled of wet wool, ink, and the sour tang of a man who had not slept in 2 days. The clerk, a thin creature named Holloway, whose collar always seemed too large for his neck, slipped inside carrying a tray balanced precariously on one palm. "Mr. Vane said you wanted the ink straight away, sir," Holloway muttered, avoiding Proctor's eyes as he set the tray down on the table with a clatter that made the candle flame dance violently. "And the quill, though I reckon the nib's near spent. We've been at it since dawn." "A spent nib will have to serve," Proctor said, moving to the table and lifting the lid from the inkwell. The liquid inside was black and viscous, reflecting the candlelight like a pool of oil in a gutter. "We are not waiting for perfection, Holloway. We are waiting for the truth, and it rarely arrives with a fresh point." Holloway hovered by the door, wringing his hands in a nervous rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, a sound that had suddenly become audible now that the voices had ceased. "Shall I fetch Mrs. Gale, then? She's been sitting in the holding room near the cells. She hasn't spoken a word since they brought her in, just stares at the floor like she's counting the cracks in the flagstones." "Bring her," Proctor said, dipping the quill and scratching the nib against the rim of the pot to encourage the flow. "But do not speak to her, do not offer comfort. Let her carry whatever weight she has gathered in that room straight to this table." Holloway nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and vanished back into the corridor, leaving the door ajar so that the dim light from the gas jet in the hallway sliced across the room, cutting through the candle's softer glow. Proctor watched the dust motes dancing in that beam, swirling in chaotic eddies that mirrored the confusion of the last 48 hours. He thought of Hannah Brown, or what remained of her, scattered across the parishes like refuse swept under a rug, her identity reduced to a head in a handkerchief and a trunk in a canal. He thought of Greenacre, polishing his spectacles in a cell, perhaps already drafting the lies he would tell the judge, the smooth, respectable lies of a grocer who knew the price of sugar but not the cost of a life. The sound of shuffling feet returned, louder this time, accompanied by the heavy tread of a turnkey. Sarah Gale appeared in the doorway, flanked by the burly officer whose hand rested lightly but firmly on her upper arm. She looked smaller than she had in the sketches Proctor had seen of the women who frequented the rookeries, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, as if to ward off not just the cold, but the very gaze of the room. Her face was pale, the skin beneath her eyes bruised with exhaustion, yet her chin was lifted at a defiant angle that suggested a spirit not yet fully broken by the machinery of the law. "Sit," Proctor said, gesturing to the wooden chair opposite him. He did not soften his tone, for kindness here would be a cruelty, a false promise that the outcome might be anything other than what the evidence demanded. Gale moved to the chair but did not sit immediately. She looked at the table, at the inkwell, at the blank sheet of paper waiting to be stained with her confession or her denial. "You have the coat," she said, her voice a dry rasp that sounded as though it had been dragged over gravel. "Jacobs told me you have the coat. Does that not suffice? Must you pick the bones of a woman who is already cold in the ground?" "The coat is a thing," Proctor replied, keeping his eyes on the paper as he tested the nib with a tentative scratch that left a dark, jagged line. "Things can be moved, sold, lost. They speak of transactions, not intentions. I need to know why you held it, Sarah. I need to know what you thought was inside when you wrapped it in your own shawl." "I thought it was linen," she whispered, the words tumbling out too quickly, rehearsed yet trembling with a genuine fear that tightened the skin around her mouth. "He told me it was linen, fine linen for a customer in the country. Would I ask to see the goods of a man who pays my rent? Would I question the word of a gentleman?" "A gentleman does not ask a woman to carry a parcel that smells of death," Proctor said, looking up then, fixing her with a stare that refused to blink, refusing to let her look away into the shadows of the room. "And a gentleman does not flee to America while his accomplice sits in a Bow Street cell waiting for the hangman's call." "He is not a gentleman," Gale snapped, the defiance flaring bright and sudden before collapsing back into misery. She sank into the chair, her hands clutching the edge of the seat until her knuckles turned white. "He is a devil, and I am a fool, but I did not kill her, Mr. Proctor. I swear on my own life, I did not strike the blow." Holloway stepped forward, dipping his own quill, ready to capture every syllable, every hesitation, every lie that might later be dissected in the Old Bailey. The scratch of the nib on paper began, a rhythmic, scratching sound that filled the room, louder than the wind, louder than the distant rumble of a cart on the cobbles outside. Proctor watched Gale's lips move, forming the words that would either save her or condemn her, knowing that the truth was likely somewhere in the silence between them, hidden in the spaces where fear had choked off the story. "Start from the beginning," Proctor commanded, his voice low, merging with the scratch of the quill. "Tell us about the ring. Tell us about the morning you went to the pawnbroker, and do not leave out the part where you knew exactly whose finger it had come from." Gale opened her mouth, but no sound came out immediately. She looked at the inkwell, then at the door, then finally at Proctor, her eyes wide and wet with tears she refused to shed. The candle flickered again, casting her shadow against the wall, where it merged with Proctor's own, two dark shapes entangled in the light, indistinguishable from one another in the gloom. "The ring," she began, her voice breaking on the word, "was gold, bright as a sovereign." The quill scratched on, devouring the night, one word at a time, while the fog outside pressed against the windowpanes, waiting to swallow whatever remained of the morning. The word hung in the air, heavier than smoke from the tallow candle, carrying with it the weight of a life traded for coin. Proctor leaned forward, the wood of the chair groaning under his shift in weight, and watched the way Gale's throat worked as she swallowed down the rest of the truth. He knew the pawnbroker on Edgware Road, a man with eyes like cracked marbles who would remember a woman selling a dead girl's ring just as surely as he remembered the rain. There was no use lying about the metal, not when the ledger existed, and not when Holloway's quill was already scratching the admission onto the page. "Whose finger?" Proctor asked, the question landing flat and hard on the table between them. Gale flinched, her shoulders hunching inward as if expecting a blow from the hand resting near the inkwell. She looked at Holloway, then at the door, seeking an escape route that the turnkey's bulk had already sealed off. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, pulling the light away from her face until she looked like a sketch half erased by a damp cloth. "Hannah's," she said, the name barely audible, a ghost of a sound that vanished before it could reach the walls. "He gave it to me, said she wouldn't need it where she was going, said it was payment for my silence." "Payment," Proctor repeated, testing the shape of the word. "For silence regarding what, Sarah, the linen or the blood?" She rubbed her hands together, a frantic, rhythmic motion that chafed the skin raw. The smell of her rose up then, distinct beneath the stale odor of the jail, a mix of lavender water and the sour tang of fear sweat that no soap could wash away. It was the scent of a woman who had slept in her clothes for 3 days, who had washed her face in cold water from a pump and tried to scrub the guilt from her pores. Proctor felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the old cynicism warring with a sudden, unwelcome pang of pity. He had seen this before, the way women were used as shields by men who stood behind them while the law fired its volleys. "I didn't know she was dead," Gale whispered, her eyes fixing on the flame of the candle as if she hoped it might consume her. "Not until I wrapped the trunk. By then he had the knife. He had the saw. You should have seen him, Mr. Proctor, calm as a man cutting cheese in his own shop." Holloway paused, his quill hovering above the paper, waiting for permission to record the horror. Proctor gave a slight nod, granting the words entry into the official record where they would later be dissected by barristers seeking blood. The room grew colder, the draught from the window seeping through the sash and stirring the hem of Proctor's coat. He thought of the parcel on the pavement, the coarse paper, the handkerchief smelling of lavender, the same scent that clung to Gale now, a circle closing tight around her neck. "The trunk," Proctor said, keeping his voice level, stripping away the emotion so only the facts remained. "Where did he take it?" "To the canal," she answered, the words tumbling out faster now, driven by the need to purge the memory. "Regent's Canal, near Lisson Grove. He had a cart. He said the water would carry it away to the Thames and no one would be the wiser." Proctor sat back, the leather of his chair creaking in the quiet. He had suspected the canal, had walked the towpath until his boots were slick with mud, but hearing it confirmed felt like swallowing a stone. The water moved slow there, choked with weed and refuse, a perfect grave for a woman no one was looking for. He looked at Gale, really looked at her, seeing the tremor in her hands and the way her breath hitched in her chest. She was guilty, yes, of aiding him, of carrying the burden of his sin, but the malice belonged to the grocer who sat in a cell elsewhere, counting the hours until the drop. "And the head," Proctor asked, Did he tell you where he left the heads? Gale shook her head, a quick, jerky motion that sent a lock of hair falling across her eyes. No, he kept that separate, said it was too dangerous to move together. I swear to you, I thought I was helping a friend move goods. I didn't know until it was too late to turn back. Too late, Proctor murmured. He reached for his spectacles, wiping them with the handkerchief from his pocket, though the lenses were already clear. It was a habit, a tic that grounded him when the evidence threatened to overwhelm the man. You are too late now, Sarah. The only question remaining is whether you hang beside him or walk free when the judge throws out the case for lack of intent. She looked up then, hope flaring bright and desperate in her wet eyes. Walk free, you would let me go. I would see justice done, Proctor corrected, standing up slowly as his left shoulder protested the movement. And justice requires the whole truth, not the parts you think I want to hear. He walked to the window, pressing his hand against the cold glass. Outside, the fog had thickened, turning the street into a grey void where the gas lamps burned like distant stars. Somewhere out there, Greenacre was waiting, perhaps believing he had slipped the net, perhaps polishing his boots for a journey that would end at Newgate. Proctor turned back to the room, his decision made. The confession was enough to hold her, enough to bind Greenacre when they caught him, but it was the location of the remains that would seal the fate of them all. Holloway, Proctor said, not looking at the clerk, finish the deposition, have her sign it before the ink dries. And then, Holloway asked, dipping the quill again. And then we send a constable to listen Grove, Proctor replied, his gaze locked on Gale. We dredge the water, we find the rest of her. Gale bowed her head, her hands folding in her lap, surrendering to the machinery she had helped to start. The candle sputtered, casting a long, distorted shadow across the floor that reached towards the door like a reaching hand. Proctor stepped over it, moving towards the hallway where the night air waited, cold and sharp, ready to carry the news to the men who would drag the canal at dawn. The Parcel of Bones is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. James Greenacre. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.